Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Wide Awake Horror today. Just want to say, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join the family. And as always, if you like these stories, you know what to do. Smash that like button and let us know in the comments what you think. And as always, enjoy the stories.
I'd never been on a date that made me second guess my entire dating life until I met Kevin. I was already a little nervous, but who isn't when they go out with someone they don't know? I had talked to him for a couple of weeks on a dating app, and we seemed to have some similar interests. He was tall, good looking, and he had this kind of confident vibe that honestly made me a little excited. It wasn't the kind of excitement you feel when you're super comfortable, though. It was that buzz, like, okay, this could go somewhere. But that was about to change really quickly. We met at a nice restaurant, a place that had dim lighting and that low-key, fancy vibe to it. I'd been there before with friends, so I wasn't too worried about the place. The vibe was casual enough to keep me relaxed, and when Kevin arrived, he had this easy smile that made me think maybe he wasn't so bad after all. We got seated at a table by the window, and things started off pretty normal. We talked about where we worked, what we liked to do for fun, and I even learned he was into fitness. I thought that was cool since I was into working out too, and we kind of bonded over that. He talked about going to the gym every morning and how it was an important part of his life. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then it got weird. The first red flag came when he casually asked me about my salary. I was sipping my drink when he just threw it in there, like it wasn't a big deal. He asked how much I made at my job and if I was planning to get a promotion soon. I didn't understand why he was asking this at all, but I gave a vague answer, something like, I'm doing fine, just focused on doing my job well. He didn't seem satisfied with that and pressed even further. That's when I started to get uncomfortable. It was like a switch flipped in him after that. He smiled and said something like, I've always liked women who have their own thing going, but I wouldn't date someone who doesn't understand the importance of family. I mean, I want to have kids soon, and I need a woman who's already thinking about that. The way he said it made me feel like he was talking about an agenda, not just a casual conversation. He was looking for answers I wasn't ready to give. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. I said something about how I was focused on my career right now and didn't really want to have kids anytime soon. That's when he leaned forward, looking serious. He told me that was fine for now, but that I'd change my mind when I was older. I had barely started my 20s, and this guy was already talking about how my priorities would shift as I aged. He made it sound like he already knew more about my life than I did, and I was barely getting to know him. As the night went on, I tried to keep things casual. But then Kevin started going deeper into his own thoughts on what he considered right and wrong in relationships. He told me how important it was for a woman to be submissive in a relationship. It wasn't even a suggestion. He flat out said that's what he was looking for. He explained that a real relationship only worked if the woman knew her place, and if she didn't, the relationship was doomed to fail. He didn't say these words in a way that was soft or even considerate. He said it like it was a rule. It was like my stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here I was just trying to enjoy a night out with someone new, and he was talking about women like they were meant to serve some role he had already decided for them. I could feel my heart rate pick up, and for the first time that night, I started looking for an excuse to leave. But it wasn't just that comment. There was more. He told me that he didn't think women who were too independent were worth his time. He didn't even try to hide it. He said he didn't care for strong, independent women because they were too difficult to deal with. He went on to explain that women who were too career-driven didn't know how to prioritize their family. His tone wasn't even angry. It was just matter of fact, as if these beliefs were obvious truths, and anyone who didn't agree with him was just wrong. At this point, I was trying to think of a way to politely leave, but I didn't know how. I'd only known this guy for a couple of hours, but it felt like I was trapped in a conversation I couldn't escape from. His views on women were not only outdated, but downright offensive. I wanted to tell him that I didn't agree with any of it, but I didn't know how to break it to him without it being awkward. Then came the ultimate moment of realization. He looked at me seriously and said, I just want to make sure that you're on the same page as me. I don't want to waste time on a relationship with someone who doesn't want the same things I do. It was like he was giving me an ultimatum. There was no room for compromise, no room for discussion. He had already decided what he wanted, and it didn't seem like he cared whether or not it was actually right for me. I could feel the frustration building inside me. This date was supposed to be about getting to know someone new, not about being told how I should live my life or what I should want. I was already mentally packing up my things and planning my exit strategy, but before I could get up, Kevin took a moment to compliment me in the worst way possible. He told me that he liked how easy it was to talk to me, but that I definitely need to work on being more feminine. That was the last straw. I knew I had to leave. It wasn't even about him not being my type. It was about how uncomfortable he had made me and how little respect he showed for my autonomy. I paid for my part of the meal, and I didn't even wait for him to react. I grabbed my coat, stood up, and walked straight out the door. I didn't even care if he was confused or upset. He had shown me enough of who he really was, and I didn't need to stick around to hear more. As I walked away from the restaurant, I couldn't help but wonder how many women had put up with men like Kevin, thinking they had no choice but to accept their controlling views. It made me sick. And more than anything, it made me realize that no one, no matter how charming they might seem at first, is worth sacrificing your own values for. I'm going to be honest, I wasn't expecting much when I met Emily. We met on a dating app, and at first, everything seemed to be going well. We exchanged a few messages, talked about the usual stuff: movies, books, hobbies. You know, the usual fluff that fills out the early stages of talking to someone online. It didn't seem like a romance movie or anything, but I was intrigued. She had this dry sense of humor that I could appreciate, and I thought that maybe we could have a good time. At the very least, I figured it would be a nice evening out. When we finally decided to meet in person, I was kind of excited. I didn't have any crazy expectations, but I thought we might actually get along well. She seemed to be someone who could carry on a conversation and had a bit of an edge to her that I liked. We picked a coffee shop in the city center. Nothing fancy, just somewhere low-key to grab a cup and chat. She was the kind of person who didn't seem to be into pretentious venues, and I liked that. It felt like she was keeping things real, which was refreshing. When Emily walked in, I immediately noticed something off. She was wearing these oversized sunglasses and had this aura about her, like she was waiting for everyone to look at her. I tried not to let it bother me too much because, hey, maybe it was just her style. The problem wasn't the sunglasses, though. It was the way she carried herself, like she was always ready to drop a bombshell and make everyone uncomfortable. She sat down across from me with a grin on her face, like she had some kind of inside joke. I wasn't sure what it was about, but I figured I'd let her explain. We started with the usual small talk. I asked her about her job. She told me she worked in marketing and had recently started a new project she was excited about. She asked me about my job, too, but I talked about how I was working in finance. The conversation was fine, I guess nothing extraordinary. But then came the moment when the whole vibe shifted. Emily just out of nowhere dropped a bombshell. She told me she had just broken up with her ex, but she wasn't quite over it yet. And then, without skipping a beat, she started talking about how amazing he was and how he treated her better than anyone else ever had. I was taken aback, to say the least. Who does that? Who talks about their ex like that on a first date, especially so casually? But I didn't say anything at first because maybe it was a slip of the tongue. Maybe she was just still processing things, you know. People sometimes talk about exes without thinking about it, especially when they just gotten out of a serious relationship. But then she just kept going on and on. She mentioned how he was perfect for her, how they were so compatible, and how they just clicked. She even laughed a little, almost like she was reminiscing about a good time in her life. As she spoke, I could feel my stomach turning. The weird thing was that she wasn't even ashamed of it. She wasn't embarrassed to talk about how amazing her ex was right in front of me. It wasn't even a subtle mention. She was basically glowing as she talked about him. By now, I was pretty uncomfortable. I didn't know how to react. I didn't want to interrupt her, but I also didn't want to sit there listening to her romanticize someone who wasn't even part of the picture anymore. And the worst part, she didn't even seem to notice how awkward it was getting. She was just happily telling me how her ex was everything and how he knew her better than anyone else. It wasn't just the fact that she was talking about her ex. It was the way she said it. The way she looked almost nostalgic, like she was still hung up on him and couldn't get over it. She even mentioned that she was still keeping in touch with him, but that she wasn't sure if it was healthy for her to do so. I tried to change the subject. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to just sit there listening to her talk about her ex-boyfriend as if I wasn't even in the room. So I asked her about something else, her favorite hobbies, something light to try and steer the conversation away from this awkwardness. That didn't work. Emily went right back to talking about her ex, but this time it was more personal. She told me about how he had always been what she needed and how she missed the way he supported her. She started going into deep detail about how he always sensed when she was feeling down and how he was the one who taught her how to really live life. I almost choked on my coffee. It was like she was describing a saint or some kind of perfect human being. At this point, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she was completely absorbed in her past. And to make it worse, she was comparing me to him. She wasn't outright saying it, but the way she kept going on and on about her ex qualities made it pretty clear. She wasn't trying to get to know me. She was still trying to relive her past relationship through me. I didn't know what to say. The whole date had turned into a therapy session for her. I felt like I was the therapist just listening to her talk about her emotional baggage without a hint of consideration for how it might make me feel. I'm not saying I'm some perfect date, but at least I was trying to get to know her, not comparing her to my ex or making her feel like she was just a stand-in for someone else. And then, as it couldn't get worse, she casually mentioned how she had already forgiven her ex for everything, but that she couldn't quite let go of him. She said she was still trying to work through it and figure out what went wrong. It was like she was emotionally dumping everything on me. It wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a therapy session, but with none of the professional distance. I wanted to walk out, I really did, but I didn't. I stayed because I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want to just ditch her because of her issues, but the more she talked, the more it became clear that she wasn't ready for a new relationship. She wasn't even ready to give anyone else a chance. After what felt like hours of listening to her go on about her ex and how much she missed him, I finally found a way to end the date. I told her I had a work meeting to attend, and she seemed disappointed but didn't push it. I paid for my coffee, gave her a quick, awkward hug, and walked out of the cave. I don't know why, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt drained. That date had sucked the energy right out of me. She wasn't a bad person. I don't want to make her sound like a villain. The whole night felt like a test I wasn't prepared for. I get that breakups are hard, and people need time to process things. But if you're not over your ex, maybe it's a good idea to stay away from dating for a while. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but think about how strange dating had become. There was this constant pressure to be someone you weren't, and Emily's date had just confirmed that not everyone was in the same place emotionally. I had been excited to meet her, but it ended up being a lesson in patience, and not the kind I was hoping for. I thought I had it all figured out when I met John. He was tall, with dark brown hair that fell perfectly into place, and he had that type of smile that made you think he was an approachable guy. He seemed normal at first, nothing special, just a guy like everyone else. But after the first few minutes of talking, I quickly realized that I couldn't have been more wrong. It all started when we decided to meet up for drinks. We chose a quiet bar downtown, one of those places where you could actually hear each other talk without shouting over loud music. The moment I walked in, I saw him sitting at the bar, looking relaxed with a cold beer in hand. He stood up to greet me, and we exchanged pleasantries, laughing about how both of us had to navigate traffic to get there. Nothing out of the ordinary. We ordered drinks and sat down. The conversation started fine enough. We talked about the usual stuff: work, hobbies, what we like to do for fun. But then, almost out of nowhere, John asked me something that caught me off guard. It was one of those questions that, on the surface, didn't seem like a big deal, but in hindsight, it was one of the first signs that something was off. He asked, "So, do you think women are better at multitasking or men?" I was confused for a second. Was this some kind of trick question? I gave a vague answer about how it probably depended on the person, not their gender, and that everyone has different strengths. But John didn't like that answer. He immediately started talking about how men were naturally better at focusing on one thing at a time, and that women tend to spread themselves too thin. I tried to steer the conversation away from this odd topic, but it didn't work. John was on a roll, ranting about how he thought women were just too emotional to be effective in the workplace. He went on and on about how men were the real leaders because they didn't let their feelings cloud their judgment. At first, I thought he was joking, but the longer he spoke, the more I realized he wasn't. He truly believed everything he was saying. He told me that real men didn't show emotion, that it made them weak. I felt a pit in my stomach. I had heard guys talk like this before, But hearing it from someone sitting right across from me on what was supposed to be a casual date made it even worse. It wasn't just the fact that he was so vocal about his opinions, it was the way he said it like it was an unbreakable truth, and anyone who didn't agree with him was just wrong. It didn't stop there, though. John quickly shifted the topic to his ex-girlfriend, and I soon realized that the bitterness running through him wasn't just some random opinion, it was personal. He talked about how she ruined his life by cheating on him and how all women were the same, just out to use men. He didn't even try to hide his disdain for women. It was that the whole conversation was him unloading years of bitterness and anger onto me, a complete stranger. He described how his ex had played the victim and how she convinced him to believe in love only to turn around and stab him in the back. It was clear that he still hadn't gotten over it. He told me that he didn't trust women anymore, that they were all manipulative and out for their own gain. He even said that he couldn't understand why women thought they deserved everything without putting in the work. He was fuming. His face was red, his voice was raised, and it was like I was sitting in front of a ticking time bomb. I tried to remain calm, tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but John wasn't having it. He wasn't interested in my opinions, not really. He just wanted to vent, and he didn't care who was listening. He continued on about how he could never trust a woman again, how all relationships were doomed from the start. They're just going to screw you over no matter what, he muttered, shaking his head. I didn't know what to say. It was like every time I tried to get a word in, he would just steamroll over me. I sat there, trying to process the things he was saying, trying to figure out what had made him so jaded. I understood that a bad breakup could make anyone bitter, but this was something different. This wasn't just bitterness. It was hatred. It was like he had completely written off every woman he had ever met. As he continued his rant, he started talking about how women were just gold diggers, looking for the next paycheck, and that they had no real value unless they were useful to men. He said that men were the ones who built things, who made the world go round, and that women just took advantage of that. The more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I felt. My hands were starting to sweat, and I could feel my heart racing. This was not what I had signed up for when I agreed to go on a date with him. I tried to calm myself down, thinking that maybe he was just hurt and angry. Maybe he needed time to heal. But that wasn't the case. John wasn't looking for healing. He was looking for validation. He wanted someone to agree with him, to confirm that women were the problem and that men were the victims in every situation. It was exhausting, honestly. At one point, he said, I don't care what anyone says. Women just don't know how to keep a relationship going. They want everything handed to them on a silver platter, and then when they get it, they don't appreciate it. It was at that moment that I realized this date was over. There was no coming back from this. I could feel myself getting angry, but I also knew that if I said anything, it would only make things worse. He was so far down this rabbit hole of hatred that there was no way I could change his mind. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I told him I had to go. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't going to sit there listening to him bash women for the next hour. I paid for my drink, stood up, and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave. He seemed a little surprised, but honestly, I didn't care. I wasn't about to sit through more of his toxic views. I didn't owe him anything. As I walked out of the bar, I couldn't help but think about how different this date could have been. It could have been fun, lighthearted, maybe even the start of something great. But instead, it had turned into a nightmare, and I was left feeling drained, like I had just survived a battle I never signed up for. As I made my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about John. I didn't know what had made him so bitter, but I knew that he wasn't someone I could change, and that was the hardest part. You see someone who's so broken, and you want to help them, but you realize that they're not looking for help. They're looking for someone to confirm their worst fears, and that's a dangerous place to be. I haven't talked to John since that night. I don't think I ever will. I don't even know if he realized what he was doing. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I couldn't be part of that world. There are some people who get so stuck in their own bitterness that they can't see beyond it, and I wasn't about to let him drag me down with him. I think about that date every now and then. It was the worst date I've ever been on, but it taught me something important. Some people aren't ready to be in a relationship, and that's okay. What's not okay is when they try to drag everyone else down with them.
Hey guys, really sorry to disturb you, but if you're enjoying the stories up until this point, please smash that like button. That's all I'm asking for you guys. Let's break some records this year. Now, back to the stories.
I've never been one to shy away from a first date. I mean, everyone has their awkward moments, right? It's part of the fun. But when I met Mike, things got weird faster than I expected. I still remember the night like it was yesterday. It was one of those perfectly crisp evenings when the city lights seemed just a little brighter and the air felt fresh. I had just gotten off work, so I wasn't really in the mood for anything too fancy, but I was looking forward to the chance to meet someone new. Mike seemed like a decent guy, at least from his profile. He had a good job, some interesting hobbies, and most importantly, he seemed funny. We had exchanged a few messages, and everything seemed pretty easygoing. Little did I know that this date was going to be anything but easy. We decided to meet at this small, cozy Italian restaurant that had a nice vibe, dim lighting, candles on the tables, and a menu full of delicious-looking dishes. It wasn't too crowded, so we could actually hear each other speak without shouting. Mike was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window. He looked good, dressed casually in a button-up shirt and jeans. I couldn't help but smile a little as I walked over to him. We greeted each other, exchanged a hug, and sat down. Things started off pretty well. We talked about the usual stuff, our jobs, what we like to do for fun, and shared a laugh about some of the awkward moments we'd had in past dates. It felt pretty normal, you know. There was a relaxed vibe, and I thought maybe this could turn into something. But then it started. Mike casually started talking about his ideal woman. I didn't think much of it at first, thinking he was just trying to figure out what kind of person I was. As he went on, it became clear that his ideal woman wasn't just some abstract concept. It was me, or at least, it was the version of me that he had created in his head. He started talking about how he couldn't stand women who didn't take care of themselves. At first, I assumed he meant being healthy or fit, which seemed fine. I mean, I like to work out, and I wasn't going to argue with someone who had the same interests. But then, he got more specific. He told me that he couldn't date a woman who didn't look perfect all the time. He went on about how he couldn't stand it when women let themselves go. He even said that a woman's appearance is everything, and how it was the most important thing he looked for in a relationship. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I was staring at him, trying to process what he was saying, but it was like I couldn't get the words to register. He wasn't just talking about being healthy. He was talking about a standard of beauty that, to be honest, felt a little unrealistic. He kept going on about how he'd never date a woman who wasn't fit enough, wasn't polished enough, or didn't have the right look. He said that a woman had to maintain her figure if she wanted to keep a man interested. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in taking care of yourself and staying healthy, but the way he was saying it made me feel like I was sitting across from someone who didn't care about who I was as a person, just what I looked like on the outside. I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say something, but I wasn't sure how to get my point across without it getting awkward. And then came the real kicker. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You know, I really admire women who take care of their bodies. I can't date someone who doesn't put effort into their appearance. I mean, if you don't care about looking good, what does that say about how much you care about the relationship?" I'm sure he thought he was being honest, or maybe even charming, but all I could think was, what the hell? He wasn't even trying to hide it. He was literally sitting there, telling me that the only thing that mattered in a relationship was how I looked. He was basically telling me that if I didn't meet his standard of perfection, there was no point in continuing. I didn't even know how to respond to that. I wasn't the kind of person who could just sit there and accept being reduced to my looks. It was like he had already written me off, like I had to meet a certain level of attractiveness for him to even take me seriously. He even had the audacity to say, "It's not about being shallow, but come on, we all know looks matter." By now, I was starting to get frustrated. I wasn't upset because I didn't think I looked good enough for him. It wasn't about me. It was about the fact that he was more concerned with my appearance than who I was as a person. It was as if everything I'd said up to that point, every detail I'd shared about myself, my job, my interests, my hobbies, didn't matter. All that mattered was whether I met his unrealistic standards. I tried to change the subject, but he wouldn't let up. He kept pushing it. He told me about his ex-girlfriends and how they were always in shape, and how he couldn't deal with someone who didn't keep up. The more he spoke, the more it felt like he was putting me in a box, defining me by some arbitrary set of rules. I was starting to feel like I was on trial, being judged not for who I was, but for how I looked. And the worst part, it wasn't even just the way he spoke about it. It was the way he said it like it was something everyone should just agree with. Like, if you didn't care about your appearance the way he did, you were doing something wrong. I felt my anger rising, but I held it in. I didn't want to make a scene, but I didn't know how much longer I could tolerate this conversation. I wasn't going to sit there and let him define my worth based on how much makeup I wore or how many hours I spent at the gym. I wasn't that person, and I didn't want to date someone who thought I should be. So I did the only thing I could think of. I got up and went to the bathroom, took a few deep breaths, and tried to calm myself down. When I came back to the table, Mike was still sitting there, looking expectantly at me, as if he didn't realize how out of line he'd been. He hadn't even noticed the shift in the mood. When I sat down, I knew I had to say something. I couldn't just sit there and pretend everything was fine. So I looked him straight in the eye and told him that I wasn't interested in continuing the date. He was taken aback, of course. He asked why, and I didn't hold back. I told him that I wasn't looking for someone who valued appearance over everything else. I explained that I wanted someone who could appreciate me for who I was, not just for how I looked. Mike seemed confused. He tried to backpedal, saying he didn't mean it that way, but I wasn't having it. It was too late. I wasn't going to let him talk me into thinking his views were okay. I wasn't going to let someone tell me I wasn't enough unless I fit into a mold they created. I paid for my drink, stood up, and walked out. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I owed him an explanation. I just knew that I didn't want to be with someone who saw me as a trophy to be displayed rather than a partner to be respected. As I walked out of the restaurant, I couldn't help but shake my head. I knew I deserved better than that. And in that moment, I realized that there's no point in trying to meet someone's unrealistic expectations. I wasn't looking for perfection, and neither should anyone else. It was supposed to be just another casual date. Nothing fancy, no expectations, just a chance to get to know someone new. But the moment I met Anna, I should have known it wasn't going to be just any other date. Anna was different. She had this vibe about her, like she was carrying around a ton of weight that I wasn't prepared to handle. I had met her online, of course. We had swapped a few messages and exchanged stories about our work and interests. She seemed chill at first, even funny. She told me she worked as a graphic designer, and I told her about my job in marketing. We both liked to hike and spent our weekends exploring new spots. It all sounded pretty normal. We decided to meet at a quiet cafe in the city. It was one of those places with big windows, wooden tables, and the smell of freshly ground coffee in the air. I wasn't expecting anything too fancy. Anne was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a coffee in front of her. When I walked in, she looked up, smiled, and waved me over. She was wearing a denim jacket and had this carefree. I don't try too hard look about her, which I found refreshing. We sat down, ordered drinks, and exchanged a few pleasantries. For the first 10 minutes, it was like any other first date. We talked about our hobbies, movies, the usual stuff. But then Anna started talking about something I wasn't expecting. At first, it seemed innocent enough. She mentioned her previous relationships and how she was learning to move on from them. I didn't think much of it. But as she spoke, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There was an undertone of discomfort in her voice, like she was trying to downplay something that was bothering her. She started talking about her ex-husband. It wasn't what I expected to hear. I wasn't trying to get into someone's past so early, but Anna seemed to have a lot on her chest. She told me that she had been married for 4 years and that things had ended badly. That's when I got the first inkling that this wasn't just another casual conversation. She went into detail about how her ex-husband had emotionally manipulated her and how their entire marriage had been a toxic mess. Anna wasn't just venting about a past relationship. She was still carrying the emotional baggage of it. She told me that she had been deeply in love with her ex and that she had sacrificed everything for him. She said she put aside her own dreams and ambitions to support his career, but in the end, he had cheated on her. As she spoke, I could see the anger in her eyes, even though she was trying to keep it together. It was clear that the wound hadn't healed, and she was still deeply affected by everything that had happened. I felt bad for her. I really did. I could see that she was struggling with the aftermath of her marriage, but as she kept talking, something didn't sit right with me. She kept repeating how much she had done for him, and how he had taken advantage of her. It wasn't just the details of the cheating that bothered her. It was everything about how she had given him everything. and how he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. I tried to listen, of course. I didn't want to be the guy who cut her off or made her feel worse. But as she kept going, I started to feel like I was drowning in her past. It was almost as if she was trying to use me to fill a hole that her ex-husband had left behind. She wasn't asking for closure. She was asking for sympathy. And that's when the conversation took an even stranger turn. Anna started to talk about how she wasn't sure if she could ever trust men again. She said she had given up on love because every time she opened up, she ended up getting hurt. She went on to say that, despite everything she'd been through, she was still holding out hope that someone would come along and fix her. It wasn't exactly a red flag, but it was something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't trying to be judgmental, but it was clear that Anna was still emotionally tangled up in her past, and that's when she dropped the bombshell. She casually mentioned that her ex-husband was still in her life, and not only that, they were still technically married. She said that while they were separated, they hadn't gone through the legal process of getting divorced. It was as if she didn't even see it as an issue. She explained that she wasn't ready to get divorced because she was still figuring things out. I sat there stunned. I didn't know how to react. We had been talking for only an hour, and here she was, telling me she was still tied to her ex-husband legally and emotionally. I asked her about it, and she said, "I know it sounds complicated, but it's just how things are right now. We're not together, but we're still not divorced. I'm just not sure if I'm ready to fully close that chapter yet." I didn't know what to say. She wasn't in a relationship with her ex, but she wasn't really single either. She was in this weird gray area, and I was sitting across from her, a stranger, trying to make sense of it. It was obvious that she was still in love with him, or at least still trying to find a way to reconcile the pain he caused. But there I was, just another guy she was venting to, trying to figure out where I fit in all of this. The more she spoke, the more I realized that I wasn't just on a date. I was in the middle of a therapy session. Anne didn't just want to talk about her past, she was trying to make sense of it, and I was for sounding bored. It felt like I was being drawn into her mess, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. As the night went on, she told me more about her ex-husband, the emotional manipulation, the lies, and how much she had sacrificed for him. It was like she was reliving the whole thing all over again. At one point, she said, "I thought I could never love again after him, but here I am, still trying to figure out how to move on." It wasn't just a breakup to her. It was a defining part of her life, and it was clear that it was still controlling her every decision. At this point, I knew the date was over. It wasn't that I didn't feel bad for her. She had clearly been through a lot, but I wasn't prepared to be her emotional crutch. I wasn't ready to be a part of the mess she was still sorting through. I wasn't her therapist, and I wasn't interested in being part of her not quite divorced situation. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew I had to go. I couldn't keep sitting there, listening to her talk about her ex. I told her I had an early morning meeting and needed to leave, but she didn't seem too upset. I could tell she was more focused on her own thoughts than on anything I was saying. As I paid for the drinks, I couldn't help but wonder if this was a pattern for her. How many times had she gone on dates, unloaded all her emotional baggage, and expected the guy to just be okay with it? I walked out of the cafe, feeling a mix of frustration and sympathy. I felt bad for Anna. She had clearly been through a lot, but she wasn't ready to move on. She was still emotionally tied to her past, and she wasn't looking for a fresh start. She was looking for someone to help her fix it. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had met someone who was still deeply hurt by her past, and it had affected the way she viewed relationships. I realized that sometimes, no matter how much you like someone, you can't help them until they're ready to help themselves, and in Anna's case, she wasn't ready yet. It was one of those first dates that you think is going to be fine, maybe even fun, but you walk away from it feeling completely drained and questioning everything about yourself. I had met Jack on a dating app a few weeks before, and we hit it off pretty quickly. We had a lot in common. Similar interests, some of the same favorite movies, and both of us had recently gotten out of long-term relationships. The conversations were easy, casual, and we shared a couple of decent laughs. I was looking forward to meeting him in person. We decided to meet at a trendy little cafe downtown. It was one of those places that had that hipster vibe, exposed brick walls, minimalistic furniture, and overpriced lattes that people pretended to enjoy just because they were trendy. Still, I liked the vibe, and I thought it would be a good spot to talk and get to know each other. When I arrived, Jack was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked exactly like his pictures, dark hair, a sharp jawline, and this confident air about him. He stood up when I walked in and gave me a hug, which was nice and not too forward. We exchanged pleasantries and then sat down to chat. At first, it was just like any other first date. We talked about work, travel, family, and the usual introductory stuff. It felt lighthearted and easy, and for a while, I thought maybe this could turn into something. But as the conversation went on, things began to take a turn that I wasn't prepared for. Jack started talking about his expectations for a relationship. At first, I thought he was talking about the usual stuff, things like communication, trust, and respect. But then he started getting more specific. He told me that he had very high standards when it came to relationships, and that if his partner didn't meet those standards, things wouldn't work. I wasn't too concerned at first, thinking he was just outlining his values. But then it got a little more intense. He started telling me about how important it was for his partner to be ambitious and driven. He said he couldn't date someone who didn't have clear goals in life or who wasn't constantly working towards something. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, but the more he went on, the more I realized he was implying that anything less than perfection wasn't good enough. He said things like, "I want someone who's always pushing themselves, and someone who doesn't settle." It wasn't that I didn't agree with him about ambition being important. It was just the way he said it. There was a certain pressure in his words, like he expected me to already be at the pinnacle of success. As he spoke, I started to feel like he wasn't really seeing me as a person. He was seeing me as a potential project that needed to be perfected. He went on to say that he could never be with someone who wasn't constantly improving themselves, and that he expected more from his partner than just a regular job and casual interests. At this point, I felt like I was starting to sing in my seat. I hadn't even gotten comfortable in the conversation before he was telling me about how much I had to change if I wanted to be the right fit for him. And then came the real kicker. Jack started talking about how he was looking for someone who could keep up with him. He said that he was always working on self-improvement, and that he needed a partner who was constantly pushing the limits and challenging him. He told me that he worked out every morning, had a strict diet, and didn't have time for distractions. He even mentioned that he could never be with someone who didn't care about their physical appearance in the same way he did. This was starting to feel less like a date and more like a job interview. It wasn't about who I was or what I was about. It was about meeting some ridiculous standard that he had set up in his head. I didn't know how to react. I wasn't upset with him for having his own goals and standards, but the more he talked, the more I realized that he wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for someone who would fit into this narrow, idealized version of a person he had created. He wasn't even interested in me as an individual. It was more like he was shopping for a perfect match that could check off all his boxes. He had this list of qualities that I had to meet if I wanted to be in his life. The weirdest part of all of this was that he kept talking about how much he valued honesty and openness in a relationship. But at the same time, he was setting up these impossible standards for his partner to follow. I started to feel like I couldn't be honest with him about who I was, because he wasn't actually interested in that. He just wanted me to be something I wasn't. He wanted someone who was constantly striving to be better, but at what cost? Who I was wasn't enough for him. I wasn't enough. I tried to push back a little to explain that I didn't believe that every relationship had to be about this constant pressure to achieve more. I told him that I valued personal growth, but I also valued balance, taking time for the little moments, not just grinding away every single day without a break. But he wasn't hearing it. He brushed it off, saying, "You'll understand once you're in a real relationship with someone who's always moving forward." At this point, I started feeling suffocated. It was like he was projecting all his own expectations onto me, and no matter how much I tried to push back, it wasn't going to be enough. I wasn't perfect enough. I wasn't working hard enough. I wasn't what he wanted. The whole time he was talking, I couldn't help but feel this growing sense of discomfort. It wasn't about the fact that he was ambitious. It was the way he talked about it. It was as though there was no room for imperfection in his world. There was no space for mistakes, for relaxation, for just enjoying life. And for me, that felt exhausting. I didn't want to be with someone who didn't accept me for who I was. I didn't want to be with someone who was constantly holding me to some impossible standard. Finally, after what felt like hours of him talking about his high standards and expectations, I knew I had to get out of there. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even upset, really. I was just completely and utterly drained. I didn't want to be in this conversation anymore. I didn't want to keep pretending that I was okay with the idea of fitting into this mold he had created. I politely told him that I needed to leave. He looked confused, like he didn't quite understand why I was cutting the date short. I didn't want to get into a big debate about it, so I simply told him that I didn't think we were a match. I paid for my coffee, said goodbye, and walked out of the cafe. As I stepped outside, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and disappointment. It was a relief to get out of that pressure-filled environment, but it was also disappointing to realize that someone could be so caught up in their own expectations that they couldn't see the value in who I really was. I didn't need to be perfect for someone else. I needed to be accepted for who I already was. The rest of the evening was a blur. I spent the night reflecting on the date, thinking about how often people like Jack expect others to change to fit their ideals. It wasn't about compatibility, it was about conformity. And in that moment, I realized that there was no way I could be with someone who wasn't willing to accept me as I was. It took me a while to process everything that had happened. Jack wasn't a bad guy. He was just someone who had a very narrow view of what a relationship should look like. But for me, I realized that I wasn't looking for someone to fix me or to expect perfection. I was looking for someone who would accept me, flaws and all. And that's the most important thing I learned that night. It's funny how you can talk to someone for a while, feel like you're clicking, and then in the span of just one evening, everything goes completely sideways. That's exactly how my date with Emily went. I had met her online a couple of weeks before, and we hit it off pretty well. We had a lot in common, similar interests, a shared sense of humor, and both of us had recently gone through breakups, so we could relate to the whole starting over thing. Honestly, it felt like I was talking to a mirror. We made plans to meet up at a local bar one Friday night after work. Nothing too fancy, just a chance to meet in person and see if the chemistry was real. I showed up a little early, which wasn't unusual for me. I liked to get there and settle in before the date started. When I saw Emily walking toward the bar, I couldn't help but notice how pretty she looked. Long dark hair, a nice dress, and this natural confidence that made her stand out. She had a smile that was easy and warm, and she was the kind of person who made you feel at ease just by walking into the room. I couldn't wait to sit down and start talking in person. We grabbed the table and immediately started chatting. At first, everything felt just as easy as it had online. We laughed, shared stories, and had a casual conversation about work, life, and what we liked to do for fun. I didn't think there was anything to worry about. Everything seemed pretty normal, at least at first. But then the conversation took a strange turn. Out of nowhere, Emily started talking about her expectations for a relationship. I didn't think too much about it at first. People talk about what they want in a relationship all the time, right? But as she kept going, I started to realize that what she was saying wasn't just some casual list of things she hoped for. No, it was a rigid set of criteria that made me feel like I was already falling short. It wasn't even just a list. It was a blueprint for how a relationship should look. And let me tell you, it wasn't a blueprint I was interested in following. She started off with something simple enough. She mentioned how she was looking for someone who was emotionally available and ready to commit. Fair enough, I thought. Those are things anyone would look for. But then she got into specifics. She said she couldn't date someone who didn't have their life together. She went on to explain that she needed a partner who was financially stable and had a plan for the future. Again, nothing too shocking, but it started to feel a little heavy. She talked about how important it was that her partner have clear goals and be successful in their career. It felt like she was checking me off on some invisible checklist that I wasn't even aware existed. I began to feel like I was being tested. The next part was where things started to get more intense. Emily said she didn't want someone who wasn't driven enough or lacked ambition. She said that she wanted a partner who was always striving for more and never settled for mediocrity. I wasn't sure how to respond. I wasn't someone who sat around doing nothing. I had my own ambitions, I had a job I worked hard at, and I made sure to keep improving myself. But the way Emily was saying it made it sound like I had to be perfect, like there was a very specific version of me that she expected to meet. It wasn't just about having ambitions. It was about meeting this incredibly high bar that she had set up in her mind. As she kept talking, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. It was like she was laying out this perfect image of the kind of person she wanted, but it wasn't a conversation, it was a lecture. Every time I tried to talk or share something about myself, it felt like I was getting compared to this impossible standard she had created. She said that she couldn't date someone who wasn't constantly pushing themselves, who didn't work out every day, and who wasn't constantly improving their lifestyle. It wasn't just about being with someone who was a good fit for her. It was about finding someone who was a direct reflection of her own idealized version of a perfect life. I didn't know how to react at first. I was honestly taken aback. It was one thing to have high standards for a relationship, but it was something else entirely to be given this exhaustive list of requirements for what my life had to look like in order to meet her approval. I started to wonder if she was even interested in me at all, or if she was just looking for a checklist to tick off. And the more she talked, the more I realized that nothing I said or did was going to be good enough unless I fit into this idealized version of success and perfection that she had built up in her mind. The strangest part was when she said, "I just need someone who's going to challenge me. I need someone who's better than me in some ways, so I don't feel like I'm dragging them along." She didn't mean better in a healthy, encouraging way. She meant it in a way that made me feel like I was already falling short, like no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough to meet her standards. She wanted someone who was going to constantly elevate her, but it felt like she was asking me to elevate myself to a level that wasn't even realistic. At this point, I started to feel suffocated. I wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. It wasn't about two people coming together to share a connection. It was about meeting these unattainable standards she had created in her head. I wasn't even sure if she could see me for who I was, or if she was just seeing me as a project that needed to be shaped into her version of the perfect partner. It felt like I was being held to an impossible standard that I had no idea how to meet. She told me about her past relationships and how they had all failed because the guys weren't driven enough or didn't meet her expectations. She mentioned how she couldn't waste time on someone who wasn't going places. It was clear that she had set up these rigid rules in her mind about what a relationship should look like, and anyone who didn't meet them was automatically disqualified. It wasn't just about love. It was about checking all these boxes and proving that you were worthy of being in her life. I was starting to feel like I was on the defensive, and that's when I realized I wasn't even enjoying the date anymore. I wasn't having fun. It felt like I was being lectured about everything I wasn't and everything I needed to be. I didn't know how to break it to her, but I knew this wasn't going to work. I couldn't be with someone who didn't accept me for who I was, someone who wasn't willing to see me beyond her list of expectations. Finally, I decided to cut the date short. I didn't want to cause a scene or make things awkward, so I told her that I had an early meeting and that I needed to head out. She seemed a little disappointed, but I could tell she didn't fully understand why I was leaving. I paid for my drink, gave her a polite smile, and walked out of the cafe. As I stepped outside, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't upset, but I was definitely relieved. I had realized that there was no point in continuing a relationship with someone who couldn't see me for who I was, someone who had already decided who I needed to be in order to be worthy of her time. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me or make me perfect. I was looking for someone who would accept me, flaws and all. The rest of the evening felt like a blur. I was still processing everything that had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to settle for someone who had a laundry list of expectations that I couldn't meet. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't need to be, and neither did she. I'd never been on a date that made me feel so confused and uncertain about everything. I met Anna online, and from the start, we had this easy flow of our conversations. We seemed to get along well, shared a sense of humor, and bonded over some mutual interests. She was warm, funny, and we had a lot of common ground. I'd been talking to her for about a week before we decided to meet up, and I was genuinely looking forward to it. She suggested we go to a nice little cafe downtown, one I had never been to before, but it had great reviews, so I thought, why not? The night of the date, I was feeling a little nervous, but in a good way. You know the kind of nervousness that comes from anticipation. It wasn't that I was expecting fireworks, but I was excited to meet Anna in person and see if the connection we had online translated into real life. I arrived at the cafe a bit early, which wasn't unusual for me. I like to be punctual. When she walked in, I immediately recognized her from her photos. Anna had that kind of effortless beauty that seemed natural. She looked just like she did in her pictures, her long brown hair, bright eyes, and that radiant smile. We greeted each other with a friendly hug, and I immediately felt at ease. We sat down at a corner table by the window, and the conversation started off just like it had online. We talked about our jobs, travel, books, and the usual first date chit-chat. Everything felt easy. But as the evening wore on, things started to take a strange turn. It wasn't anything major at first, but I began to notice that Anna kept bringing up her past relationships. I wasn't entirely thrown off by it because, hey, I get that people want to talk about their past, but the more she talked, the more I began to sense that something wasn't quite right. She mentioned her ex-boyfriend in passing, and I didn't think much of it, but that it seemed like every other sentence was about him. I didn't mind at first. I mean, everyone has baggage, right? But as she continued, it became clear that she wasn't really over him. She told me that she had been in a relationship with her ex for 3 years and that they had been soulmates. That's when things started to get weird. Anna didn't talk about her ex like they had just been a chapter in her life. No, she talked about him like he was still a part of her life, like they were still together in some way. She said that they had been in constant contact since the breakup, and even though they hadn't seen each other in a while, she still considered him a close friend. She also said that she had been struggling to let go of him. The thing was, she didn't sound like someone who was processing her feelings. She sounded like someone who was still holding onto the relationship as if it had never ended. I listened carefully, unsure of how to respond. I had no problem with people being in touch with their exes, but there was something in her tone that didn't sit right with me. She wasn't just talking about her ex with nostalgia. She was talking about him with longing, as though they were still emotionally connected in a way that went beyond friendship. It didn't stop there. Anna started talking about how her ex had been the one for her, how they had been through so much together, and how she still thought about him all the time. It wasn't the kind of conversation I expected to have on a first date. It was clear that she was still emotionally attached to him, and it didn't take long for me to realize that she wasn't ready to move on. As much as I wanted to be sympathetic and understanding, I could feel myself pulling away. I didn't want to be the rebound, and I didn't want to be caught in the middle of someone else's unresolved feelings. At one point, she even said, "I know I'm probably not ready for another relationship yet, but I just need someone who can understand me." I didn't know what to say to that. Was she saying she wasn't ready to date? Was she looking for validation, someone to fill the void her ex had left behind? I wasn't sure, but I knew I didn't want to be a part of whatever emotional roller coaster she was still riding. She went on to tell me that she had no regrets about the relationship and that she would always care about him. But then she added something that struck me as odd. She said, "I think about him all the time, and sometimes I wonder if we're just supposed to be together. I mean, he was everything I wanted in a partner. But I'm also trying to move on, It's just hard." It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't just a casual conversation about an ex. This was Anna's way of telling me that she wasn't really over him, and that she was still emotionally tied to him in a way that I couldn't compete with. I felt like I was just a temporary distraction, someone to keep her company while she figured out her feelings. And that's when I started to feel uncomfortable. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to help her, to comfort her and be supportive, but I quickly realized that this wasn't something I could fix. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for someone to step into the role of a placeholder until she was ready to let go of her past. I wasn't prepared for that, and honestly, I didn't want to be in that position. So I decided to be honest with her. I told Anna that I was enjoying our conversation, but I wasn't sure if we were on the same page. I told her that it seemed like she was still very much focused on her past, and I wasn't sure if that was something I could be a part of. I wasn't trying to be mean. I was just trying to be clear about my own feelings. I didn't want to waste her time or mine if she wasn't truly ready to move forward. To my surprise, Anna didn't get defensive. She seemed to understand. She told me that she appreciated my honesty and that she knew she had a lot of emotional baggage to work through. She admitted that she was still healing from her past relationship and wasn't ready to fully commit to anything new. She thanked me for being understanding, and I could tell she wasn't angry, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made me feel bad for her. It was clear that she was still struggling with letting go, and I didn't think I could be the person to help her with that. We ended the date on good terms, and as I walked out of the cafe, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just happened. It was hard to ignore the fact that I had just been in the presence of someone who wasn't emotionally ready for a new relationship. I wasn't angry at her, but I was disappointed. I had hoped that this date would be the start of something exciting, but instead I was left questioning what I had just experienced. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Anna. I felt bad for her, but I also realized that I couldn't be with someone who wasn't fully ready to move on from their past. It wasn't fair to either of us. She had a lot of work to do on herself before she could be in a healthy relationship, and I wasn't willing to wait around while she sorted it out. Eventually, I decided that it was best for both of us to walk away. I wasn't looking for someone who was still emotionally tied to their ex. I was looking for a fresh start, for someone who was ready to embrace a future, not cling to the past. I never reached out to Anna again, and while I don't regret the time we spent together, I learned an important lesson. You can't build a future with someone who is still living in the past. It's a hard lesson to learn, but one I'll carry with me into future relationships. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship when I met Jack. He seemed like a breath of fresh air at first. I wasn't looking for anything too serious, just someone to enjoy some time with, and Jack appeared to fit that casual mold. He had this easy charm about him, good looks, a solid sense of humor, and this self-assured confidence that made him seem like the kind of guy who had it all together. Our conversations flowed easily, and he didn't seem to take things too seriously, which was a nice change after my last relationship. We agreed to meet up at a local bar on a Friday night, somewhere cozy with a good vibe. When I walked in, I spotted him right away. He was sitting at the bar, sipping a beer, looking like he was perfectly at ease. He stood up when I approached, smiling wide and offering me a handshake, which quickly turned into a hug. The chemistry between us seemed to be there right from the start. He was easy to talk to, and we found the conversation without too much awkwardness. It felt like the kind of date that might lead to something nice, at least. That's what I thought in the beginning. At first, everything was light and fun. We talked about our jobs, hobbies, and what we liked to do on the weekends. Jack told me about his work in finance, which was pretty standard stuff. He asked me about my job, and I shared that I was working in marketing. We made small talk, and I thought, okay, this could be going somewhere. The conversation didn't feel forced, and I appreciated that. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice something strange. Jack started asking questions that were a little too personal, and they came out of nowhere. At first, I brushed them off as curiosity, but then I realized that this wasn't just small talk. He wanted to know how much money I made at work, how often I traveled, and even how much time I spent with my friends. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, it seemed like he was trying to get to know me better, but on the other hand, it felt invasive, like he was trying to gather data for some kind of assessment. I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but Jack was persistent. He asked if I thought about my long-term plans and where I saw myself in the next 5 years. It was the way he asked it that bothered me. There was an edge to his voice, like he was measuring my answer against some kind of standard. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just being forward, right? But as the night went on, things started to feel a little off. Jack's questions kept coming, and they weren't the kind of questions you ask on a casual date. They were the kind of questions that made me feel like he was trying to figure out if I was worth his time. He started getting into my personal life, asking about my past relationships. When I told him I'd just gotten out of a long-term relationship, he immediately asked what went wrong. I wasn't prepared to dive into that conversation so early in a date, but I gave him a brief answer saying it didn't work out, and that was that. But Jack wasn't satisfied with that. He pushed me further, asking for more details, and I started to feel like I was being grilled. I could see the intensity in his eyes. He wanted to know why it didn't work, why I hadn't stayed, and whether I was ready for something serious now. I didn't understand why he was asking all of these personal questions. It wasn't that I had anything to hide, but I didn't think it was appropriate to get so deep into my past, especially on a first date. I started to feel uncomfortable, and I tried to change the subject again. But Jack wasn't letting it go. He started talking about his own past relationships, and that's when things took a weird turn. He told me that his ex had ruined his life, and that he could never trust anyone again. He went on about how women were hard to trust, and that he always had to keep an eye on them to make sure they weren't trying to take advantage of him. I was shocked. He wasn't just being bitter about a breakup. He was sounding paranoid, like he was painting all women with the same brush. It was like he was projecting all of his past disappointments onto me, even though we'd only known each other for a few hours. As Jack continued talking about his ex, I could tell he was bitter. He talked about how she had taken him for granted and how she had played mind games with him. He mentioned that he could never be in a relationship with someone who wasn't honest and loyal to the point where it felt like he was holding me accountable for things that happened in his past. It felt like a red flag, but I didn't know how to address it without making the night awkward. He then told me that because of his past, he had certain rules when it came to relationships. And that's when I started to realize that Jack wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for someone who would adhere to his rigid set of expectations. He said that in his next relationship, he would never allow his partner to walk all over him. and that they needed to be in sync with him at all times. He mentioned how he couldn't deal with independent women who didn't need him. That's when the red flags started flashing brightly in my mind. He continued by telling me that he believed in a very traditional view of relationships. He said that a man should be the leader and that a woman should support him. I wasn't sure if he was joking or being serious, but his tone made it clear that he wasn't kidding. He explained that relationships should be about balance, but in his eyes, that balance meant that the man was always in control. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as though Jack was laying out his expectations for a relationship without even asking if I shared the same views. I sat there frozen, listening to him talk about how his relationships would always work if the woman just followed his lead. He kept saying that he would never tolerate disrespect or let a woman take advantage of him. It was clear that he didn't trust me or anyone really to be on equal footing. It was like he was setting up these strict guidelines that didn't leave any room for mutual respect or understanding. I started to feel suffocated, like I was being backed into a corner. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had been listening to him go on for what felt like hours, and I realized that this was not the kind of person I wanted to be around. I wasn't looking for someone who wanted to control me or dictate the rules of a relationship. I didn't want to be with someone who didn't believe in equality or respect. I wasn't sure how to get out of it without causing a scene, but I knew I had to leave. I excused myself to the bathroom, took a few minutes to collect my thoughts, and when I came back, I told Jack that I wasn't feeling a connection and that I needed to go. He seemed surprised, even a little confused, like he didn't understand why the night had taken such a sharp turn. He tried to convince me to stay, but I wasn't having it. I paid for my drink, smiled politely, and walked out of the bar without looking back. As I stepped outside, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I didn't want to be with someone who thought relationships were about control and dominance. I didn't need someone who tried to impose their own views on me or tried to dictate how I should behave. I realized that sometimes the red flags are there from the very beginning, and it's up to you to recognize them before they become something you regret. That night, as I walked home, I thought about everything Jack had said. I realized that I wasn't just looking for someone to share my life with. I was looking for someone who respected me, someone who saw me as an equal. I didn't need anyone's approval to be myself. I didn't need someone who wanted to change me. What I needed was someone who accepted me for who I was, flaws and all, and Jack clearly wasn't that person. I should have known the moment Lilo walked in that this date was going to be different. There's a certain energy that people have when they're completely sure of themselves, and Lila definitely had that. She had a presence about her that made you want to take notice, but I wasn't sure if I liked it. It wasn't the usual nervousness or excitement you feel when meeting someone new. It was more like an aura of control, like she was someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Maybe it was the way she walked into the cafe with that air of confidence, or the way she smiled as she sat down, but something about it made me wonder whether this was going to be an easygoing, fun date, or something much more complicated. I met Leila through a mutual friend who said she was really cool and easy to talk to. We had chatted a bit online before agreeing to meet up for coffee, and she seemed genuinely interesting. She had a job in advertising and was passionate about art, which I thought was cool since I was really into graphic design. We got along well in the few conversations we'd had, and I felt pretty comfortable with the idea of meeting her. When she sat down across from me at the cafe, I smiled and immediately noticed how striking she was. She had short, dark hair that framed her face perfectly, and her eyes had a certain intensity that drew me in. She was dressed casually but stylishly, nothing too over the top, just enough to show that she cared about how she looked. We exchanged the usual pleasantries at first. She asked me about my work, my hobbies, and what I like to do for fun. The conversation was light, and we both laughed a few times, making casual jokes. But something in her tone, the way she spoke, made me feel like she was keeping something back, like she wasn't just casually talking to me, she was assessing me. It wasn't long before she started laying out her rules for relationships. Now, I don't mind hearing someone's expectations, but Leela was different. Her rules weren't about general preferences. No, she had this rigid structure, a set of guidelines that were non-negotiable. At first, I thought she was just joking. Maybe she was one of those people who liked to make things sound more serious than they were. But the longer we talked, the more I realized that these rules were actually a part of her philosophy on relationships. They were the framework by which she judged people, including me. Lila started by telling me that, in her opinion, relationships could only work if both people were equally invested. She wasn't wrong there. I think most people feel that way. But then she dropped the first bombshell. She said, I don't believe in waiting around. I believe in clear intentions. If someone's not ready to make things official within the first month, it's over. I'm not wasting my time. I was a little taken aback. A month? That seemed really fast. I mean, sure, if two people are clicking, that's one thing. But to have that kind of expectation right out of the gate felt intense. I tried to play it cool, though. I didn't want to be rude or dismissive. So I nodded, trying to absorb it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was already falling short. But she wasn't done. The more she talked, the more I realized that Leela's rules were rooted in this idea of control. Control over the timing, control over expectations, and ultimately control over the relationship itself. She went on to explain that she didn't believe in playing games. To her, everything had to be straightforward. She said, I want someone who knows what they want. If someone isn't clear about their feelings, I'm done. I won't chase someone. Ever. I wasn't sure how to take that. On the one hand, I appreciated the clarity. I respected someone who knew what they wanted. But on the other hand, it felt like there was no room for anything other than perfection. No room for uncertainty or for letting things evolve at their own pace. Everything had to be rigidly defined. And I wasn't sure if I was okay with that. As she continued, her rules seemed to grow more and more specific. She told me that she couldn't be with someone who didn't value their independence. I understood that to a degree. I think everyone should have their own life and passions outside of a relationship. But then she took it further. She said, I need someone who doesn't need me all the time. I can't be with someone who expects me to fill every void in their life. I wasn't sure if she was referring to me, but the implication was clear. Lila was essentially saying that if I wasn't emotionally self-sufficient to the point where I didn't need her, then this wouldn't work. She wanted someone who was entirely self-contained, and to be fair, maybe that worked for her. But it didn't sit well with me. Relationships for me were about mutual support, not emotional isolation. As the date went on, Lila's rules started to feel more like a list of things I could or couldn't do to be with her. She wasn't looking for someone to share an emotional connection with. She was looking for a partner who could meet her criteria without any room for compromise. I started to realize that she didn't really want to build a relationship based on mutual understanding. She wanted someone who could check off her checklist. She was very clear about what she wanted, but it felt more like a business transaction and the start of something meaningful. Leela's conversation about relationships began to feel less about connecting with someone and more about what I could offer her, what I could fit into her predetermined picture of a perfect relationship. She told me that she didn't believe in wasting time with someone who didn't have the same level of ambition. She said, if you don't have your life together by the time you're 30, what are you doing? At that point, I felt like I was being judged. Sure, I had a job I liked, but I wasn't on some rigid, predefined trajectory. I wasn't in a rush to tick off boxes the way she was. And the more she spoke, the more I started to realize that I wasn't the one in control of this situation. I wasn't allowed to just be me. I had to be the version of myself that fit into her worldview, and I wasn't sure if I wanted that. She told me that she couldn't be with someone who wasn't constantly growing, someone who didn't have a clear vision for their life. She went on about how she couldn't stand people who were stagnant or didn't know where they were going. She made it clear that she wasn't looking for someone who could just be along for the ride. I found myself sinking lower in my seat, trying to process everything she was saying, but it felt like there was no space for me to be myself, no room for mistakes, or for life to not be perfect. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. Her list of rules felt like it was never ending, and it seemed like no matter how much I tried to steer the conversation back to something lighthearted, she was always circling back to her expectations. It wasn't even about chemistry anymore. It was about whether I could meet her exact standards. Finally, after what felt like hours of listening to her talk about her deal breakers and non-negotiables, I realized that this date was over. I wasn't going to change to meet her expectations. I wasn't going to force myself into a mold just to fit into her perfect vision of a relationship. I wasn't looking for someone to control my life. I was looking for someone to grow with, not someone who wanted a checklist. I politely excused myself and told her that I didn't think we were a good match. Lila seemed surprised, but didn't argue. She thanked me for being honest, and I walked out of the cafe feeling a huge weight lift off my shoulders. It was like I had just been released from a pressure cooker, and I could breathe again. As I walked down the street, I thought about everything that had just happened. I didn't need to meet someone else's rules. I didn't need to fit into their perfect version of a relationship. I needed to find someone who could accept me as I was, someone who could see me for who I was, not just for what I could offer them. I don't know why I agreed to meet Anna. We had been talking online for a few weeks, and I had liked her profile. She seemed genuine, funny, and easygoing, so when she suggested we meet up for coffee, I was looking forward to it. I thought it would be a good chance to see if we clicked in person. I had just come out of a complicated relationship myself, and I wasn't in the mood for anything too serious, just a fun, casual date to see if we had a connection. At first, it seemed like that's exactly what I was walking into. The coffee shop was quiet, the kind of place where the aroma of freshly ground beans mixed with the sound of soft indie music playing in the background. Anna was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table near the window, scrolling through her phone. She looked exactly like her photos. Short brown hair, bright eyes, and that approachable smile that made you feel like she was easy to talk to. We greeted each other, and she stood up to give me a hug. Her energy was warm and inviting, and for a moment I felt completely comfortable. We sat down, and at first everything felt easy. We talked about the usual stuff, our jobs, hobbies, travel plans, and for a while I thought, this could be a great connection. She was funny, quick-witted, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But then, as we got deeper into the conversation, things started to feel off. Anna began talking about her previous relationship. At first, I didn't think much of it. A lot of people talk about their exes early on, and I figured it was just part of getting to know someone. But the more she talked about him, the more I realized that she wasn't talking about it in a way that someone who had moved on would. She talked about him with a kind of wistful longing, like she was still deeply invested in what they had. It didn't hit me right away, but as she spoke more about him, I started to notice little things that made me feel uncomfortable. She mentioned how she and her ex had been together for almost 3 years, and how they had just clicked from the start. She said that they had such a strong emotional connection that she thought they were soulmates. I really thought we'd end up together forever, Anna said, and there was something in her voice that made me stop. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said it. It was clear she was still emotionally tied to him, and I wasn't sure if I was comfortable being the guy who had to hear all about it. But she kept going, diving into more details about their time together, how they had shared so much, and how everything had felt perfect, until it wasn't. Her voice faltered as she spoke about the breakup. She said that things started to fall apart when her ex became distant and withdrawn. She didn't really go into specifics, but she mentioned how she had tried everything to save the relationship, how she had poured so much of herself into it. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He just stopped trying, she said, and I was left alone trying to pick up the pieces. I didn't know what to say. I felt bad for her, of course, but the more she talked about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a breakup for her. It was something she had never really moved on from. She was still deeply hurt by it, and I started to feel like I was on the receiving end of a conversation I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't a casual date. It was becoming a therapy session for her unresolved feelings. She went on to explain how she had tried to date again after the breakup, but that nothing felt the same. I just don't feel like connection with anyone else, she admitted. I don't know if it's because I haven't healed yet, or if I'm just not ready for someone else. She even told me that she'd been keeping in touch with her ex, texting him from time to time, and that sometimes they would still meet up for coffee. That's when things really hit me. It wasn't just that she was still emotionally attached to her ex. It was that she was actively holding on to that connection, even though she was sitting across from me on a date with me, trying to move forward. I didn't know if she saw me as someone to move on with, or if I was just a placeholder while she tried to make sense of her past. At that point, I wasn't sure how to respond. I was conflicted. On one hand, I wanted to be supportive and understanding because I could tell Anna was going through something difficult. On the other hand, I didn't want to be her emotional crutch, her rebound, or her next best option, while she figured out her unresolved feelings for someone else. I wasn't looking for a casual fling or a role as her therapist. I was looking for someone who could give me the same emotional availability and investment that I was willing to offer. I decided to take a risk and be honest. I told her that I appreciated her being open with me, but I also felt like she wasn't quite ready for a new relationship. I explained that it seemed like she was still carrying a lot of emotional baggage from her ex, and I didn't want to be caught in the middle of that. I wasn't saying she couldn't work through her feelings or that I didn't want to see her again, but I made it clear that I wasn't comfortable pursuing something deeper if she wasn't in a place where she could truly be present. To my surprise, Anna didn't get defensive or upset. She actually seemed relieved, like she had been waiting for someone to point it out. She told me that she had been feeling conflicted for a while and that she knew she wasn't really ready for something new. I think I've been lying to myself, thinking I could just jump back into a relationship, she said, looking down at her coffee cup. I'm not over him, and I don't know if I ever will be. We sat there in silence for a moment. I wasn't sure what to say next. I had just laid out my feelings, and now she was processing it all. I didn't want to rush her or make her feel bad for something that wasn't her fault, but I also knew that I wasn't the person she needed right now. She needed to focus on herself and heal from the past before she could give her heart to anyone else, and I couldn't be part of that process. I gently told her that I thought it was best if we parted ways. I wasn't trying to hurt her, but I also knew I couldn't keep going down this road if she wasn't emotionally available. Anna agreed, and we both stood up. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. It was more like two people who would come to the realization that they weren't in the same place emotionally. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I felt bad for Anna. She had been through a lot, and I knew it wasn't easy for her to confront her feelings. But on the other hand, I felt relieved. I didn't want to be stuck in a situation where I was competing with someone's past, especially when that past was still so present in their life. It wasn't fair to either of us. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Anna. I felt bad for her, but I also realized that sometimes people just aren't ready. No matter how great the connection may seem on the surface, if one person is still holding on to their past, they won't be able to fully engage in a new relationship. I'd learned that the hard way, and I wasn't going to put myself through it again. I've always been the type of person who goes into a first date with an open mind, trying not to overthink things. But when I met Mike, I should have known something was off from the start. The conversation felt forced right from the beginning, and the vibe between us wasn't as comfortable as I had hoped. But I tried to brush it off. It wasn't that he was rude or anything. He was charming enough, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. There was this intensity, this almost suffocating energy that surrounded him, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. What made it worse was the fact that I had a gut feeling this date wasn't going to be like the others I'd been on. I had this feeling that, despite all the charm, Mike wasn't looking for someone to get to know. He was looking for someone who fit perfectly into this idealized version of a partner he had in his head. Mike and I had met on a dating app a few weeks earlier. Our conversations were a bit more in-depth than usual, and we seemed to connect on a lot of things: interests, goals, and even our sense of humor. It felt like we had potential, so when he suggested meeting up for a drink at a cozy bar downtown, I agreed. The bar was quiet, dimly lit with vintage decor, perfect for a laid-back vibe. When I walked in, Mike was already there, sitting at the bar, looking down at his phone. He stood up when I approached, offering a handshake that was a little too firm, a little too confident. I gave him a smile, trying to keep things light. He returned the smile and led me to a table, pulling out the chair for me like some kind of gentleman. We sat down, ordered our drinks, and for a while, things seemed fine. He talked about his job. He worked in real estate, and he went on about how much he loved it, how it was his passion, how he worked long hours because he was driven and committed. He told me how hard he worked to get where he was, how he had worked his way up from the bottom. I could tell he was proud of his accomplishments, and that was fine. I appreciated ambition. But the more he talked, the more I started to feel like he was trying to impress me, like he needed me to see him as this highly successful, highly driven guy. And then it started. Mike turned the conversation to relationships, and it was like flipping a switch. He told me how important it was to have the right kind of partner, someone who understood what it meant to truly be successful. He went on about how he could never be with someone who wasn't as driven as he was. I smiled politely, figuring it was a casual comment, but then it hit me he wasn't joking. This wasn't just casual banter. Mike was serious. He told me that he had a clear vision for his life, and that he couldn't waste time with someone who didn't see the bigger picture. He wasn't asking for someone to be successful in the same way he was, but he made it clear that he couldn't be with someone who wasn't on the same level. He spoke about it like he was auditioning me for a role in his life. And suddenly I realized that this wasn't just a date. This was a job interview. I wasn't just talking to him, I was being assessed. I tried to ease into the conversation, hoping to find a way to change the subject, but Mike wasn't letting up. He told me that he believed in the law of attraction, and that you had to be the best version of yourself to attract the right partner. The more he talked, the more it felt like I wasn't good enough for him, not because I wasn't ambitious, not because I wasn't driven, but because I didn't fit the mold he had in mind. It felt I was already being measured against this checklist, and I couldn't help but feel like I was falling short. He asked me about my career ambitions, my future goals, and where I saw myself in 5 years. I answered honestly, explaining that I was passionate about my job and had some personal goals I wanted to achieve. But it wasn't enough for Mike. He told me that if you're not thinking 5 or 10 years ahead, you're wasting your time. He made it sound like I should already have everything figured out, like I should have a detailed roadmap for the rest of my life. It wasn't just about career goals either. Mike had high expectations in every area of life. He talked about how important physical appearance was, how he needed someone who was fit and healthy because, in his words, if you don't take care of yourself, how can you take care of a relationship? He explained how he made sure to work out every day, eat perfectly, and maintain his peak performance because he believed in being the best version of yourself at all times. He made it clear that he was looking for someone who was already at the top of their game, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I felt like I was suffocating. This wasn't a relationship. This was a checklist, a list of boxes I needed to tick off in order to be deemed worthy of his time. He wasn't looking for someone who was a good fit for him emotionally. He was looking for someone who could mirror his own level of success, someone who could keep up with his high standards. And to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep up. The tipping point came when Mike started talking about the future. He explained how important it was for a couple to be on the same path, and how he couldn't be with someone who didn't have their life together. He said, I don't have time to waste. I'm at the point in my life where I need to focus on my career and my personal growth. I don't want someone who's just along for the ride. I need a partner who can keep up. At that moment, I felt like I was suffocating. I wasn't looking for someone who wanted to fix me, someone who needed me to be a perfect match to their ideal. I was looking for someone who could accept me for who I was, someone who wasn't going to judge me for not having every aspect of my life in perfect order. Sure, I had goals. I was ambitious, and I worked hard, but the idea that my entire life had to fit into his idea of success was too much. It wasn't that I didn't want to be successful. It was the fact that his definition of success was too narrow and unrealistic. He wanted someone who checked all the boxes on his list, and I didn't fit that mold. As the night went on and I felt the conversation shift from lighthearted to suffocating, he kept talking about how important it was to have someone who matches your energy, who is as driven and successful as you are. He wasn't talking about love or connection. He was talking about an idealized version of a relationship where two people are just mirrors of each other's success. He wanted someone who could match him in every aspect, and it became clear to me that there wasn't any room for imperfection in his vision of love. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew I couldn't keep sitting there, being measured and assessed like I was on trial. I wasn't a perfect match for him, and I didn't want to be. So I politely excused myself from the date. I told him that I didn't think we were a good match, and I thanked him for his time. He seemed surprised at first, but then he nodded and said, I understand. I get it. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I wasn't angry or upset. I just felt relieved. I wasn't looking for perfection. I wasn't looking for someone who needed me to fit into their rigid mold of success. I was looking for someone who could accept me for who I was, flaws and all. I didn't need someone to be my mirror. I needed someone to be my partner, and Mike clearly wasn't that person. That night, as I walked home, I reflected on everything that had happened. I realized that high expectations are one thing, but when they become a way of measuring your worth, they can be suffocating. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me or define my success. I was looking for someone who could walk beside me, support me, and be my equal, not someone who was just looking for perfection. I think it's safe to say that my date with Rachel was one of the most exhausting experiences I've ever had. I had met her online a few weeks before, and our conversations had been fun and engaging. She was smart, witty, and had this easy confidence that made her seem like someone I could really connect with. Our chats were casual, and we found ourselves texting throughout the day about random topics, from work to our favorite TV shows. It all seemed pretty normal, and I liked the idea of getting to know her better in person. Rachel suggested we meet at this little Italian restaurant downtown. It was cozy and had a nice ambience, a perfect place for a first date. I was looking forward to it. I thought we would have a nice dinner, talk more about our lives, and maybe find out if there was something deeper between us. Little did I know that Rachel's idea of a perfect date was very different from mine. When I arrived, Rachel was already seated at the table, sipping a glass of red wine. She looked even more stunning in person than in her pictures. Dark hair, sharp features, and a smile that was warm but also a little too perfect. She greeted me with a hug and complimented my outfit. She seemed pleasant enough, but as soon as we started talking, I realized there was something off. It wasn't her, not exactly. It was the way she spoke, like every word she said was carefully chosen, almost like she was trying to maintain this image of perfection. At first, I thought it was just nerves, but as the evening went on, I realized that this was part of who Rachel was. We started talking about our careers, hobbies, and all the usual first date topics. It was clear that Rachel was ambitious. She had a high-powered job in finance, and she talked about her work with a sense of pride and purpose. I couldn't blame her for being proud of her achievements. She had worked hard to get where she was. But as she spoke, I noticed a pattern. She wasn't just proud of her career. She was obsessed with it. She constantly talked about how much effort she put into everything she did, how she always had to be the best, how she never allowed herself to be mediocre. At first, I admired her drive. It was refreshing to hear someone so motivated. But the more she talked, the more I realized that it wasn't just about ambition. It was about control. Rachel didn't just want to succeed. She needed to succeed, and anything less than perfection was unacceptable to her. It wasn't just her work that had to be flawless. It was everything. She told me that she worked out every morning without fail, ate a clean diet, and made sure she was always looking her best. She went on and on about how she had a strict routine for everything in her life, from the way she exercised to the way she managed her time. She said that she didn't have room for mistakes or weaknesses. There was no room for imperfection in her world, and if something wasn't perfect, it wasn't worth her time. As the conversation continued, I began to feel like I was being slowly suffocated by her need for everything to be flawless. I had always believed that life was about balance. Work hard, but also take time for yourself, relax, enjoy the little things. But for Rachel, everything had to be about being the best, looking the best, and achieving the best. There was no room for failure, no room for mistakes, and certainly no room for anything that didn't fit her version of perfection. She started to tell me about her previous relationships and how they had all ended because her partners couldn't keep up with her. She mentioned how she had been with a guy who didn't have his life together and how it frustrated her to no end. "I just can't be with someone who doesn't have their shit together," she said, almost dismissively. "It's a waste of time." She went on to explain how she needed someone who was as driven as she was, someone who wouldn't slow her down. It wasn't just her partners that didn't measure up. It was everyone. She talked about her friends, too, and how she had cut people out of her life who weren't as successful or ambitious as she was. She said that she didn't have time for people who weren't doing something with their lives, people who were stagnant. It was as though she viewed life as this constant race, and anyone who wasn't running at the same speed was simply in her way. The more she spoke, the more I realized that Rachel didn't just want a partner. She wanted someone who could live up to her impossible standards. She wasn't interested in someone who would challenge her or help her grow. She wanted someone who could match her level of perfection, someone who wouldn't ever falter or fall behind. She needed a partner who could mirror her own idealized version of success. And frankly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be that person. The conversation took another turn when she started talking about marriage and what she expected from a partner in the long term. She said that she wanted someone who could keep up with her lifestyle, someone who could match her ambition and her need for perfection. "I can't marry someone who isn't as driven as I am," she said firmly. "I need someone who pushes me, who challenges me to be better." She went on to explain how she wanted to have a perfect family someday, but only with a perfect partner. At this point, I was starting to feel like I was sitting in front of a stranger. This wasn't a casual date. This wasn't a conversation about getting to know each other. This was an audition. Rachel had already decided what she wanted, and if I didn't fit her mold, I was out. She was looking for someone who could live up to her high expectations and be part of her perfect life. She wasn't interested in a partnership based on love and mutual support. She was interested in finding someone who could meet her standards of perfection. I wasn't angry at her. She had every right to want what she wanted. But I realized that I wasn't the person she was looking for. I wasn't perfect, and I didn't want to be. I didn't need to live up to some rigid set of expectations. I wanted someone who could accept me for who I was, not someone who expected me to change to fit into their idealized vision of the world. The date started to feel like it was dragging on, and I knew I had to make an exit. I wasn't having fun anymore. I wasn't feeling a connection. I wasn't looking for someone who wanted to mold me into their version of perfect. So I politely told Rachel that I had to leave. I thanked her for the conversation, but I made it clear that I didn't think we were a match. She seemed surprised, but didn't push back. We exchanged a quick goodbye, and I walked out of the restaurant, feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. As I walked to my car, I thought about everything she had said. I felt a little sad for her, to be honest. Rachel was so focused on perfection that she was missing out on the beauty of imperfection, the kind of raw, real connection that comes from being vulnerable, from embracing flaws. Life isn't perfect, and neither are relationships. I realized that I wasn't looking for someone who needed me to be perfect. I was looking for someone who could accept me for who I was, someone who could appreciate my flaws and all. I'd learned a valuable lesson that night. Perfection isn't the goal. True connection comes from embracing the messiness of life and relationships, from accepting that nobody has it all together all the time. And in that moment, I knew that I wasn't going to settle for someone who couldn't see that. I met Rachel through a mutual friend, and from the very beginning, I could tell that she was different. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made her stand out. There was something about her energy and intensity, maybe, that caught my attention. She was beautiful, of course, but it wasn't just her looks that drew me in. It was the way she carried herself, like she knew exactly who she was and didn't have time for anyone who didn't see her the same way. I liked that about her. I liked the idea of someone who wasn't afraid to be unapologetically themselves. It was refreshing. After meeting a couple of times at group hangouts, we started talking more regularly. Our conversations were easy and fun, filled with laughter and little moments where I felt like we really connected. So when Rachel suggested that we grab a drink and catch up, I was all in. I wasn't looking for anything too serious, just a chance to hang out and get to know her better. We decided on a little bar that had live music playing, a place that was casual but had enough character to make the night feel special. When I arrived, Rachel was already there, sitting at the bar and talking to the bartender. I could tell she was enjoying herself, and as soon as she saw me, she flashed that radiant smile that I couldn't help but return. She stood up, gave me a hug, and we exchanged pleasantries. Everything seemed perfect, like a normal night out with someone I was starting to feel comfortable around. The first half of the night went by without a hitch. We talked about music, our favorite movies, and what we both like to do in our downtime. It was one of those conversations that felt effortless, where time seemed to fly by. But as the night wore on, I noticed Rachel's mood shift. She started talking more about her past relationships, which at first seemed like an innocent enough subject. But then it became clear that Rachel's complicated love life wasn't just a casual topic for her. It was the backdrop for everything in her life. And for the first time, I began to realize just how much of her past still haunted her. She started by telling me about her most recent ex, and at first, I thought it was just a typical story of a breakup. She explained how they had been together for about a year, how they had met at work, and how, initially, everything had seemed perfect. But then, as relationships often go, things started to fall apart. She mentioned the usual things: communication problems, different life goals, but the more she talked, the more I realized that there was something deeper at play. Rachel's voice took on this melancholy tone as she described how the relationship ended. She told me that her ex had just stopped trying, how he became emotionally distant, and how she felt like she was the only one putting in effort. I tried so hard to make it work, she said, almost to herself. But when someone stops caring, you can't force them to try. I could hear the pain in her voice, and for a moment I felt a wave of sympathy for her. It sounded like a classic breakup, one that many people could relate to. But then Rachel started talking about how much she missed him. She didn't say it directly, but it was clear that she was still emotionally attached to her ex. The way she spoke about him was filled with this longing, this sense of unfinished business. She wasn't just grieving the end of the relationship. She was grieving the idea of what could have been. I thought he was the one, she said softly. But now I just feel like I wasted so much time trying to make something work that wasn't meant to. I wasn't sure what to say at that point. I mean, I understood heartbreak. I understood the feeling of loving someone and not having it reciprocated the way you hoped. But there was something about the way Rachel was talking about it that felt like she wasn't fully over it. It was like she was stuck in the past, unable to let go of someone who had already moved on. And as she continued to talk, I started to feel like I wasn't just on a date with Rachel. I was sitting across from someone who was still emotionally tethered to her past. She went on to tell me that she and her ex still kept in touch, that they still texted each other occasionally, and even met up a few times since the breakup. We're just friends now, she said, almost as if she was trying to convince herself. But as she said it, I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. There was no doubt in my mind that she wasn't ready to let go of that relationship, not completely. She wasn't just hanging on to the memories, she was hanging on to the idea of what they could have been. As the conversation went on, I began to feel this odd sense of being in limbo. I wasn't sure if Rachel saw me as a potential partner, or just as someone to fill the space while she sorted through her emotions. Every time I tried to steer the conversation to something lighthearted or future-focused, she would inevitably circle back to her ex. It wasn't that I minded talking about her past. I understood that it was part of who she was. But the more I listened, the more it became clear that Rachel wasn't looking for someone to help her move forward. She was looking for someone to help her relive a past that she hadn't fully let go of. At one point, I gently asked her, "Do you think you're really ready for something new, or are you still trying to figure things out with him?" It wasn't a question I had planned to ask, but it just slipped out. She paused for a moment, her eyes flickering as if she hadn't really thought about it. "I think I'm ready," she said, but there was a hesitation in her voice that made me doubt her words. We sat there in silence for a while, and I couldn't help but feel a bit lost in the conversation. I didn't want to be the guy who told her to get over it. I didn't want to sound insensitive, but I also didn't want to be the one to be stuck around while she worked through feelings for someone else. I had been in relationships before, and I knew how complicated things could get when someone wasn't truly ready to move on. It wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending that I was just as available as someone who hadn't been hurt. Finally, after what felt like hours of discussing the past, I decided to speak up. I told Rachel that I thought she was an amazing person, but that I wasn't sure if I was the right person to help her through what she was going through. I said that I could tell she wasn't fully over her ex, and that I didn't want to be part of something that wasn't fair to either of us. At first, she seemed surprised. She wasn't angry or upset, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She told me that she appreciated my honesty, but she also admitted that she hadn't realized how much she was still holding on to her past. "I guess I've just been hoping that someone would come along and make me forget all the pain," she said, almost wistfully. "But maybe I need to deal with it first." We both sat there for a while, trying to find the right words, but in the end, we both knew the date was over. I paid for my share of the drinks and got up to leave. As we said goodbye, Rachel gave me a hug, and it was clear that there was no animosity between us, just a shared understanding that we weren't on the same page. As I walked out of the restaurant, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. It wasn't that Rachel wasn't a great person. She was. But she wasn't ready for a new relationship. She was still too caught up in her past, and I wasn't going to wait around while she figured it out. I wasn't angry with her. I felt sad for her, actually. She deserved someone who could meet her in the present, not someone who was still living in the past. That night, I learned an important lesson. You can't truly be ready for a new relationship until you fully let go of the old one. You can't expect someone else to fill the void left by someone else's absence. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is walk away, even when you know it might hurt. I had no idea what I was walking into when I agreed to meet John. We had met through a mutual friend at a party, and despite having a good conversation that night, I didn't think much of it at first. But then we started talking a little more through text, and he seemed like a genuinely kind and interesting guy. Our conversations were light, humorous, and easygoing. It felt like we had a decent connection. So, after a few weeks of texting back and forth, we finally decided to meet up for a casual dinner at a local restaurant. I was curious to see if our online chemistry translated into real-life vibes. When I showed up at the restaurant, John was already seated at a table near the back, looking a little nervous but excited. As soon as I walked in, he stood up, greeted me with a warm smile, and gave me a hug. He was taller than I remembered, with messy brown hair and these bright, engaging eyes that immediately put me at ease. We sat down, and for the first few minutes, everything was just fine. We talked about how our days had gone, shared some small talk about work, and joked about the weirdest things that had happened at the office. The conversation was easy, and I couldn't help but think, okay, this could go somewhere. But then, as we ordered drinks and the appetizers arrived, John started talking about relationships. And that's when things began to shift in a way I wasn't prepared for. John began by telling me how important it was to be on the same wavelength when you're in a relationship. He said he couldn't stand being with someone who didn't get what he was all about. At first, I agreed with him. I mean, of course, you want to connect with your partner and understand each other, right? But then the more he spoke, the more it became clear that John didn't just want a connection. He wanted an idealized version of a relationship that could never truly exist. John went on to tell me about the kind of relationship he envisioned for himself. He said that he believed in soulmates, that there was one perfect person out there for everyone. I wasn't sure what to think. I mean, it was sweet, right? Who doesn't like the idea of soulmates? But the more he spoke, the more I realized that he didn't just believe in this idea. He expected it to be a reality. And not just any reality is reality. He told me that he couldn't be with someone who didn't believe in true love the way he did. He said that he needed someone who was all in from the very start, someone who could see the future with him in the same way he saw it in his mind. He went on about how he didn't believe in halfway relationships, saying that if you weren't ready to dive in fully, you weren't for him. It was starting to sound like he had an idealized version of what love should look like, and anyone who didn't match that was somehow failing. The more he talked, the more he described this picture-perfect relationship, one where everything was aligned, where there was no struggle, no growth, just pure, effortless love. He told me that when he met the right person, everything would just fall into place, and that there would be no doubts. When you know, he said with this kind of certainty, like he had the secret to love all figured out. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but as he continued, I started to feel a little suffocated. It was almost like he was saying that anything less than this perfect, ideal love wasn't worth having. The more John spoke, the more I started feeling this pressure to live up to these unrealistic expectations. It wasn't just about connecting with someone or building a relationship. It was about living up to this picture of love that was completely out of reach. I kept wondering, how can anyone meet the standard? Who could possibly live up to the idea of perfect love that he had in his mind? And then came the kicker. John started talking about the future of a relationship and his ideal life with someone. He explained that in his perfect world, relationships wouldn't involve compromise or hard work. According to him, the best relationships should just flow without any effort, because if two people were truly meant to be together, everything would naturally work out. It was like he was living in a fairy tale, one where love was supposed to be perfect from the very start, and any challenges were simply a sign that things weren't right. He went on about how he wanted to build a life together with someone who shared his exact vision, someone who was in sync with him in every way without having to work at it. If you really believe in love, you'll find that perfect balance where everything just makes sense, he said, almost as if he was trying to convince me of something that I wasn't sure I agreed with. I tried to be diplomatic. I said, I believe in love too, but I also think it requires effort. Relationships take work. It's not always going to be perfect. But John wasn't hearing it. He shook his head and said, no, it's supposed to be easy. The hard stuff shouldn't even be a part of it. When it's right, everything just clicks. That's how I know I'm looking for the right person. I felt this overwhelming sense of frustration building inside me. It wasn't that I disagreed with him about the importance of love or compatibility. It was that his version of love was so rigid and so idealized that it didn't leave room for the reality of relationships. Messy, complicated, and sometimes uncertain. Relationships aren't always going to be effortless. They require compromise, patience, and understanding. I didn't want to be in a relationship where everything was supposed to be perfect from the start. That was impossible, and more than that, it felt like he was expecting me to be something I wasn't. I could tell by his eyes that he wasn't trying to understand my point of view. He was too invested in his idealized version of what a relationship should be. He seemed so certain that he knew exactly what love should look like, but the more he talked, the more I realized he wasn't interested in real love. He was interested in something unattainable, something that didn't allow room for imperfection or growth. I tried to change the subject to find some common ground, but John kept circling back to his idea of the perfect partner. He kept telling me that he couldn't settle for anything less than what he had in his mind, that anything else wasn't worth his time. I just want someone who gets it, someone who wants the same thing I do, he said, his voice tinged with impatience. If you don't want the perfect love story, then what are we even doing here? That was when it hit me. He wasn't looking for a relationship. He was looking for a fantasy, a perfect, idealized version of love that didn't exist in reality. He was projecting his own vision of what he thought love should be onto me, expecting me to fit into this mold, to be the perfect partner that aligned with his expectations. And the moment I didn't meet that vision, I was dismissed. I knew then that this wasn't going to work. I didn't want to be part of someone's idealized fantasy. I wanted someone who was real, who understood that love isn't always perfect, that relationships require effort, compromise, and understanding. I didn't want to be with someone who expected everything to fall into place without any of the hard work that love truly takes. So I politely excused myself. I told him that I didn't think we were a match and that I didn't see a future with someone who had such rigid expectations. I could see the confusion in his eyes, like he didn't quite understand why I was leaving, but I knew I had to be true to myself. I wasn't going to settle for someone who didn't understand the real complexities of love. I paid for my drink and left the restaurant, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because I knew I wasn't going to try to force something that wasn't right for me, but disappointment because I realized that John wasn't looking for something real. He was looking for something that didn't exist. I thought I had a pretty good read on people. I'd been on a fair share of first dates, and while they didn't always lead to something serious, I'd never walked away feeling like I'd wasted my time. But then there was Sophie. When I first met her, I was immediately drawn in by her energy. She had this effortless charisma about her. Sophie was the kind of person who made you feel like the world was full of possibilities, and that everything she said and did had a purpose. I wasn't sure if it was just the way she carried herself or the way she talked about her life, but I knew there was something magnetic about her. We met at a small cafe downtown that had this quaint, cozy vibe. The moment I saw her walk in, I could immediately tell that she was someone who paid attention to the details. Her style was impeccable, casual, but put together in that effortless way that only some people seem to manage. She greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. We exchanged pleasantries, ordered our drinks, and sat down. Our first conversation was easy. We talked about work, shared some funny stories from our weekends, and laughed about the ridiculous things we'd both seen on social media. I thought, okay, this is great. This could be something real. But as the night went on, I began to sense a shift in the dynamic. Sophie had a way of directing the conversation, subtly steering it toward the topics that seemed to matter to her. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just an assertive person. But then the more she spoke, the more I realized that she wasn't just assertive, she was controlling. Sophie started talking about her past relationships, and that's when I first began to notice it. She told me about her last boyfriend, how things had fallen apart because he wasn't strong enough to handle her. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, we all have exes, and everyone has a story to tell about why things didn't work out. But as Sophie kept talking, it became clear that her version of events wasn't just a breakup. It was a power struggle. She explained that she had a very clear vision for her life, and if someone didn't fit into that vision, she couldn't be with them. I need someone who can follow my lead, she said, her voice firm, as if she was stating an undeniable truth. If they can't see the big picture, if they can't handle what I'm doing with my life, it just won't work. I'm not going to settle for someone who isn't moving forward with me. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was surprised by the intensity of her words, but part of me thought, okay, maybe she just means she's looking for someone with the same ambition. But then she added something that really threw me off. You know, she said, I like to think I'm a little bit of a fixer. When I meet someone, I want to help them improve, to bring out the best in them. But if they're not willing to put in the work, if they're not willing to change, then I'm done. Now, that's when I started to feel uncomfortable. I'm all for helping each other grow in a relationship, but there was something about the way she said it that felt a little manipulative. She wasn't talking about being a partner in the usual sense. She was talking about molding someone into the version of themselves she thought they should be, whether they were ready for it or not. And that was when I realized that Sophie didn't just want a relationship. She wanted control. As the conversation continued, she started to talk more about how she structured her life. Sophie told me about her daily routines, her well-organized plans, and her strict standards for herself and the people around her. She explained that she couldn't be with someone who didn't take life seriously. She needed someone who could match her pace, someone who could fit into the mold she had created. Everything in her life had to be perfectly arranged and controlled, down to the smallest detail. "I don't have time for distractions," she said, almost without thinking. "If you're not focused, if you're not making progress, then what are you doing? Life is too short to waste time on anything or anyone who doesn't push you forward." I felt a little suffocated. There was this unspoken pressure in her words, like if I didn't live up to her expectations, I'd be seen as wasting her time. It wasn't just that she had high standards. It was the fact that her standards were rigid, unyielding, and left no room for mistakes or deviations. There was no flexibility. Sophie didn't want a partner who was just equal to her. She wanted someone who would be in lockstep with her, following her lead without question. I tried to bring some balance into the conversation. I told her that I believed relationships were about mutual growth, about being partners who supported each other, but also understood that no one could be perfect all the time. That sometimes you had to take a step back and let life unfold without controlling every aspect. But Sophie didn't seem to understand what I was saying. She responded by saying, "But you can't just let things happen by chance. You have to create the life you want. If you don't take control, someone else will do it for you." The more she spoke, the more I realized that she wasn't just talking about life in general. She was talking about relationships, about how she needed to be the one in charge. She didn't want an equal partner. She wanted someone to fit into her vision of what a relationship should be, someone who would follow her rules and standards. And that wasn't something I was willing to sign up for. I started to feel like I wasn't even being seen for who I was. Sophie wasn't interested in building something together. She wasn't interested in compromise or understanding. She was interested in finding someone who would adapt to her needs, who would follow her lead without question, and who would conform to her idea of what a perfect relationship looked like. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't going to work. I wasn't looking for someone who needed to control every aspect of my life. I didn't need a partner who would try to mold me into something I wasn't. I needed someone who respected my individuality, who understood that we both had our own lives to lead, but that together we could support each other without needing to dominate one another. I decided to speak up. I told Sophie that while I admired her ambition and drive, I didn't think we were on the same page when it came to relationships. I wasn't looking for someone who wanted to control every aspect of my life, and I didn't think I could live up to the expectations she had set. I told her that I wasn't ready to be part of something where one person's vision dominated the others. I needed more balance than that. She didn't seem angry, but I could tell she was disappointed. She told me that she understood, but she also seemed to brush off the idea that her way of thinking might be a problem. She said, "I just need someone who can keep up. If you can't, then I guess it's not the right fit." There was no sense of compromise in her words, no effort to understand my perspective. It was just the same rigid standard. I paid for my drink, gave her a quick goodbye, and walked out of the bar. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't angry with Sophie. I wasn't even disappointed. I was just relieved that I hadn't gotten deeper into something that wasn't going to work for me. I wasn't looking for someone to control my life. I wanted someone who could walk beside me, not lead or follow. The rest of the night was a blur. I kept thinking about what Sophie had said about her need for control and how it had completely turned me off. I realized that, while it's important to have standards and goals in life, relationships shouldn't feel like a battleground for dominance. They should be a space where both people can grow together, support one another, and make room for mistakes and imperfections along the way. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the date, and I knew that I had made the right decision. Relationships aren't about controlling the other person or having everything line up perfectly. They're about finding someone who respects who you are, someone who can accept your flaws and help you grow without trying to force you into a mold. I thought I had a pretty good read on people. I'd been on a fair share of first dates, and while they didn't always lead to something serious, I'd never walked away feeling like I had wasted my time. But then there was Sophie. When I first met her, I was immediately drawn in by her energy. She had this effortless charisma about her. Sophie was the kind of person who made you feel like the world was full of possibilities, and that everything she said and did had a purpose. I wasn't sure if it was just the way she carried herself or the way she talked about her life, but I knew there was something magnetic about her. We met at a small cafe downtown that had this quaint, cozy vibe. The moment I saw her walk in, I could immediately tell that she was someone who paid attention to the details. Her style was impeccable, casual but put together in that effortless way that only some people seem to manage. She greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. We exchanged pleasantries, ordered our drinks, and sat down. Our first conversation was easy. We talked about work, shared some funny stories from our weekends, and laughed about the ridiculous things we'd both seen on social media. I thought, okay, this is great. This could be something real. But as the night went on, I began to sense a shift in the dynamic. Sophie had a way of directing the conversation, subtly steering it toward the topics that seemed to matter to her. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just an assertive person. But then the more she spoke, the more I realized that she wasn't just assertive. She was controlling. Sophie started talking about her past relationships, and that's when I first began to notice it. She told me about her last boyfriend, how things had fallen apart, because he wasn't strong enough to handle her. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, we all have exes, and everyone has a story to tell about why things didn't work out. But as Sophie kept talking, it became clear that her version of events wasn't just a breakup. It was a power struggle. She explained that she had a very clear vision for her life, and if someone didn't fit into that vision, she couldn't be with them. I need someone who can follow my lead, she said, her voice firm, as if she was stating an undeniable truth. If they can't see the big picture, if they can't handle what I'm doing with my life, it just won't work. I'm not going to settle for someone who isn't moving forward with me. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was surprised by the intensity of her words, but part of me thought, okay, maybe she just means she's looking for someone with the same ambition. But that she added something that really threw me off. You know, she said, I like to think I'm a little bit of a fixer. When I meet someone, I want to help them improve to bring out the best in them. But if they're not willing to put in the work, if they're not willing to change, then I'm done. Now that's when I started to feel uncomfortable. I'm all for helping each other grow in a relationship, but there was something about the way she said it that felt a little manipulative. She wasn't talking about being a partner in the usual sense. She was talking about molding someone into the version of themselves she thought they should be, whether they were ready for it or not. And that was when I realized that Sophie didn't just want a relationship. She wanted control. As the conversation continued, she started to talk more about how she structured her life. Sophie told me about her daily routines, her well-organized plans, and her strict standards for herself and the people around her. She explained that she couldn't be with someone who didn't take life seriously. She needed someone who could match her pace, someone who could fit into the mold she had created. Everything in her life had to be perfectly arranged and controlled, down to the smallest detail. I don't have time for distractions, she said, almost without thinking. If you're not focused, if you're not making progress, then what are you doing? Life is too short to waste time on anything or anyone who doesn't push you forward. I felt a little suffocated. There was this unspoken pressure in her words, like if I didn't live up to her expectations, I'd be seen as wasting her time. It wasn't just that she had high standards. It was the fact that her standards were rigid, unyielding, and left no room for mistakes or deviations. There was no flexibility. Sophie didn't want a partner who was just equal to her. She wanted someone who would be in lockstep with her, following her lead without question. I tried to bring some balance into the conversation. I told her that I believed relationships were about mutual growth, about being partners who supported each other, but also understood that no one could be perfect all the time. That sometimes you had to take a step back and let life unfold without controlling every aspect. But Sophie didn't seem to understand what I was saying. She responded by saying, but you can't just let things happen by chance. You have to create the life you want. If you don't take control, someone else will do it for you. The more she spoke, the more I realized that she wasn't just talking about life in general. She was talking about relationships, about how she needed to be the one in charge. She didn't want an equal partner. She wanted someone to fit into her vision of what a relationship should be, someone who would follow her rules and standards. And that wasn't something I was willing to sign up for. I started to feel like I wasn't even being seen for who I was. Sophie wasn't interested in building something together. She wasn't interested in compromise or understanding. She was interested in finding someone who would adapt to her needs, who would follow her lead without question, and who would conform to her idea of what a perfect relationship looked like. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't going to work. I wasn't looking for someone who needed to control every aspect of my life. I didn't need a partner who would try to mold me into something I wasn't. I needed someone who respected my individuality, who understood that we both had our own lives to lead, but that together we could support each other without needing to dominate one another. I decided to speak up. I told Sophie that while I admired her ambition and drive, I didn't think we were on the same page when it came to relationships. I wasn't looking for someone who wanted to control every aspect of my life, and I didn't think I could live up to the expectations she had set. I told her that I wasn't ready to be part of something where one person's vision dominated the others. I needed more balance than that. She didn't seem angry, but I could tell she was disappointed. She told me that she understood, but she also seemed to brush off the idea that her way of thinking might be a problem. She said, "I just need someone who can keep up. If you can't, then I guess it's not the right fit." There was no sense of compromise in her words, no effort to understand my perspective. It was just the same rigid standard. I paid for my drink, gave her a quick goodbye, and walked out of the bar. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't angry with Sophie. I wasn't even disappointed. I was just relieved that I hadn't gotten deeper into something that wasn't going to work for me. I wasn't looking for someone to control my life. I wanted someone who could walk beside me, not lead or follow. The rest of the night was a blur. I kept thinking about what Sophie had said about her need for control, and how it had completely turned me off. I realized that, while it's important to have standards and goals in life, relationships shouldn't feel like a battleground for dominance. They should be a space where both people can grow together, support one another, and make room for mistakes and imperfections along the way. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the date, and I knew that I had made the right decision. Relationships aren't about controlling the other person or having everything line up perfectly. They're about finding someone who respects who you are, someone who can accept your flaws and help you grow without trying to force you into a mold. I'd been out of a long-term relationship for a few months when I met Anna. It wasn't like I was jumping into anything right away, but I figured it was time to start meeting new people. After all, I wasn't looking for anything too serious, just someone to hang out with and get to know. Anna came into the picture through a mutual friend, and at first, I didn't expect much. We'd exchanged a few messages on social media, and she seemed sweet, easy to talk to, down to earth, and had a good sense of humor. Nothing about our initial interactions made me feel like it was going to turn into anything dramatic. So when we decided to meet up for drinks at a quiet bar downtown, I was just hoping for an easygoing, fun night. I had no idea what was coming. When I walked into the bar, Anna was already there, sitting at a small table by the window. She looked exactly like her photos. Long, dark hair, a warm smile, and a casual yet chic outfit that made her seem effortlessly cool. She greeted me with a hug, and we got settled. At first, everything felt fine. We talked about our work, shared a few laughs, and I found myself enjoying the conversation. But then, as the night went on, Anna started talking about her past relationships. And as she spoke, I realized that this date wasn't going to be as easy as I had hoped. She started with a story about her ex, and it seemed innocent enough. She told me that they had been together for about 2 years, and that the relationship had ended because they grew apart. I didn't think much of it at first. Breakups happen, right? But then she started talking about how she felt like her ex had betrayed her and how it had shattered her trust. The more she spoke, the more I could hear the lingering pain in her voice. Anna wasn't over it. Not by a long shot. I could see it in her eyes, the pain, the unresolved anger, the way she still wasn't able to fully process what had happened. As she continued talking about her ex, it became clear that this breakup wasn't just a chapter in her life. It was still the central story. The way she spoke about it was like she was stuck in time, as if everything about her past relationship was still dictating her present. She talked about how her ex had messed with her head and how he had played mind games. She told me that he had promised her the world, but in the end, he was just another guy who couldn't keep his word. As the conversation went on, I realized just how much Anna was holding on to her past. She wasn't just grieving the end of a relationship. She was still stuck in the emotions, the hurt, and the confusion that came with it. I listened, unsure of what to say. I wasn't about to dismiss her feelings, but I wasn't prepared for how much emotional baggage she was carrying. The more she spoke about her ex, the more I realized that Anna wasn't ready to move on. She wasn't looking for a fresh start. She was looking for someone to help her deal with the mess her past relationship had left behind. I tried to steer the conversation away from her ex, but she kept coming back to it. She spoke about him like he was still a major part of her life, like she was just waiting for some kind of closure. I can't get him out of my head, she said, shaking her head. It's like I keep going back to the same place, even though I know I shouldn't. He messed with my trust, and now I don't know if I can ever let anyone in again. I started to feel this creeping sense of discomfort. This wasn't a casual date anymore. This was a conversation about unresolved feelings, and I was beginning to realize that I wasn't just meeting Anna. I was meeting someone who was still living in the shadow of her past, and as much as I tried to empathize, I couldn't help but wonder if this was something I wanted to be a part of. I wasn't looking for a rebound. I wasn't looking to be someone's therapist. The conversation kept going, and Anna kept revisiting the past. She would tell me about her ex's actions and how he had manipulated her, how he had played the victim, and how she had felt like she couldn't trust anyone after him. She told me that she felt broken, like she was never going to be able to love again. How do you move on from someone who made you feel like you were the problem? She asked, her eyes wide with frustration. I didn't know how to respond. I felt for her, I really did. Breakups can be tough, and the scars they leave can take time to heal. But as I sat there, listening to her talk, I began to realize that Anna wasn't just talking about her ex anymore. She was talking about herself, about how she had internalized all the hurt and betrayal, and how it had shaped the way she saw relationships. She wasn't just hurt. She was deeply insecure, and that insecurity was making her defensive, making her see potential partners through the lens of her past pain. I don't know if I can trust anyone again, she said, almost pleading. How do I even know if someone's being genuine? How do I stop thinking that every guy is just going to hurt me like he did? I was starting to get overwhelmed. This was too much. It wasn't that I didn't care, of course. I cared about how she was feeling. But there was only so much I could do. I didn't sign up to be her emotional support. I wasn't prepared to take on the responsibility of helping her heal from a past relationship that she hadn't fully processed yet. It wasn't fair to either of us. I wasn't looking for a fixer-upper. I was looking for someone who was emotionally available, someone who could meet me halfway, not someone who was still tangled up in their unresolved issues. I tried to be gentle but honest. I told her that I understood what she was going through, that it was normal to feel hurt after a breakup, but that I didn't think I was the right person to help her work through it. I told her that I thought she needed to take some time to focus on herself, to heal, before trying to get involved in a new relationship. She looked at me for a moment like she was searching for something in my eyes, maybe for reassurance. There was none to give. I wasn't prepared to dive into a relationship with someone who was still emotionally unavailable. Her face fell slightly, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes. I get it, she said quietly. I know I'm not ready for something real, but I don't know how to let go of everything. I just don't know how to move forward. I wasn't angry. I wasn't frustrated. I was just exhausted. The weight of her unresolved feelings was becoming too much to carry, and I knew that if I didn't speak up, I'd be walking into a situation I wasn't emotionally prepared for. I told her that I thought we were better off parting ways, at least for now. I said that I hoped she could find the space and time she needed to heal, and that in the future, maybe she'd be in a place where she could build a healthy relationship. But it was clear to me that right now she wasn't ready. We said our goodbyes and left the cafe feeling drained but relieved. I didn't regret the date. I didn't regret meeting Anna. But I realized that sometimes, no matter how much you care for someone, you have to be honest about where they're at emotionally. You can't build something with someone who isn't ready to build with you. Anna had a lot of healing to do, and that was something she had to do on her own. As I walked back to my car, I thought about what had happened, and I came to a simple conclusion. Sometimes we have to let people go, not because we don't care, but because they're not ready for us yet. And sometimes we have to put ourselves first, even if it means walking away from a connection that seemed promising at first. I've always considered myself to be pretty easygoing when it comes to dating. I'm not someone who believes in creating a strict checklist for the person I'm with. Sure, there are some things I value in a partner: honesty, kindness, and a sense of humor. But I'm a big believer in the idea that relationships take time to grow. People are imperfect, and that's okay. I'm not interested in finding someone who checks off every single box right away. I'd rather see how we connect and how things evolve naturally. But when I met Olivia, I quickly realized that my laid-back approach wasn't going to work for her. We had met through a mutual friend who described her as smart, ambitious, and determined. I was intrigued. Olivia was clearly a woman who knew what she wanted out of life, and I admired that. We started talking online, and after a few weeks of pleasant conversations, she suggested we grab drinks at a local wine bar. I was looking forward to it. I thought it could be the start of something interesting. When I'd arrived, Olivia was already there, sitting at a corner table, her posture perfect, her eyes scanning the room with an air of confidence that I hadn't quite expected. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair and striking features that seemed to demand attention without even trying. She stood up as I approached, greeting me with a firm handshake and a warm smile. I liked her immediately. We sat down, and the conversation started off like any other first date, light and easy. We talked about our jobs, our favorite movies, and the usual icebreakers that helped ease the tension. But as we got into more personal topics, I started to notice something unsettling about Olivia. It wasn't anything overt, just little comments here and there, but they added up. There was an undercurrent to her words that I couldn't ignore. At first, it was the small stuff. She told me how much she valued ambition and how she couldn't stand lazy people. She said, "If you're not pushing yourself every day, what's the point?" It didn't strike me as odd right away. After all, I consider myself pretty driven too. But as the night went on, it became clear that her definition of ambition was much stricter than mine. She went on to tell me that she couldn't be with someone who wasn't successful, that she needed a partner who was at the top of their game. I wasn't offended by this. I understood where she was coming from. Everyone wants to be with someone who is driven and has a sense of purpose. But Olivia's standards were uncompromising. As she spoke, it felt like she was laying out this perfect version of the kind of person she expected to be with, and I was starting to realize that I wasn't going to fit that version. Olivia told me that her previous relationships had ended because her exes didn't measure up. They hadn't been ambitious enough or driven enough to meet her expectations, and ultimately, they weren't what she needed in a partner. I tried to sympathize with her, but I couldn't help but feel like she was setting an impossible standard for anyone to meet. She wasn't interested in the idea of growing together. She was looking for someone who was already fully formed, someone who was already where she thought they should be. There was no room for imperfection, no room for the kind of messiness that life often brings. The more she spoke, the more I realized that Olivia wasn't just looking for a partner. She was looking for someone who could match her pace, someone who could be on her level in every way. She told me that she needed someone who didn't settle for mediocrity and who knew how to rise above the crowd. As she continued to talk, I began to feel like I was being scrutinized, measured against some invisible set of criteria. I wasn't just being evaluated on who I was as a person. I was being evaluated on how well I fit into her vision of success. "I don't want to waste time with someone who doesn't have their shit together," Olivia said, her tone suddenly more serious. "I can't date someone who isn't moving forward, someone who isn't constantly improving. Life's too short for that. You have to be at the top of your game, or what's the point?" I was taken aback by her bluntness. I understood her desire to be with someone who was ambitious, but it felt like she wasn't leaving any room for the natural ebbs and flows of life. I didn't want to be with someone who saw relationships as a checklist or a way to prove that they were better than others. It started to dawn on me that Olivia wasn't looking for a partnership. She was looking for someone who could meet her exact standards and mirror her life in a way that made everything seem perfect. And I wasn't sure I could do that. The conversation then turned to her career. Olivia worked in finance, and she made it very clear how important her job was to her. She said that she spent most of her time at the office, that she wasn't interested in wasting time on things that didn't push her forward. "I'm not going to slow down for anyone," she said, looking at me with that same intense gaze. "I need someone who can keep up with me, someone who won't distract me from my goals." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me understood the need to focus on your career, but the other part of me felt like she was turning her entire life into one big checklist, constantly measuring how well things were going, how well she was performing. It was like she was living in this constant state of more, 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 without any sense of balance or rest. And then, as if to drive the point home, Olivia told me that she didn't believe in settling. "I don't believe in dating just to date," she said. "If I'm going to be with someone, they have to be someone who challenges me, someone who can keep up with my energy. I need a partner who can take things to the next level." At that moment, I realized that Olivia wasn't just interested in a relationship. She was looking for a mirror, someone who reflected her ideals, her lifestyle, her ambition, and her unwavering drive. There was no room for imperfection, no space to just be human. There was no room for someone who might need to take a step back, take a breather, or just enjoy life in a more balanced way. It was all about pushing forward, striving for success, and never slowing down. I tried to shift the conversation, but it was clear that she wasn't interested in hearing my perspective. She wasn't interested in hearing that relationships aren't always about being perfect or being on top of your game. Sometimes it's about being vulnerable, making mistakes, and learning together. But Olivia wasn't interested in that. She wanted someone who was already perfect, someone who could live up to her exact expectations, and I wasn't that person. I realized as the night went on that I wasn't looking for a partner who saw me as an accessory to their success. I wasn't interested in a relationship where I had to constantly prove that I was good enough to keep up with someone's standards. I needed someone who could accept me for who I was, flaws and all, not someone who only valued me if I could meet their expectations. Eventually, I decided I had to be honest with her. I told Olivia that I didn't think we were a good match. I explained that I appreciated her ambition, but that I didn't think our visions for a relationship aligned. I wasn't looking for someone who needed me to meet a rigid set of standards. I needed someone who could understand that life is a balance, not a race. The night made me reflect on my own values when it comes to relationships. I realized that relationships aren't about perfection. They're about finding someone who accepts you for who you are, someone who's willing to grow together, even if that means making mistakes along the way. I wasn't willing to settle for anything less than that. I had been out of a serious relationship for a few months, and after taking some time to focus on myself, I decided it was finally time to start meeting new people. I wasn't looking for anything too serious, but I figured I'd go into it with an open mind. That's when I met Lena. She came across as confident, sharp-witted, and full of life. Our mutual friends had set us up, and after a few conversations, we decided to meet for dinner at a cozy restaurant downtown. The idea of getting to know someone new felt exciting, and I was optimistic about what the night might bring. When I arrived, Lena was already seated at the table. She looked striking, long, dark hair, a sharp jawline, and a smile that lit up the room. I walked over, gave her a hug, and we both sat down. She had a glass of wine in front of her and was already talking about her day with enthusiasm. I liked how engaged she was, and our conversation flowed naturally at first. We talked about our jobs, mutual friends, and the usual small talk that gets a first date going. It was clear that Lena had a lot of energy, and I admired that. She seemed to have her life together, and I was enjoying the vibe. But as the night went on, I started to notice something. Lena's passion for certain things, particularly relationships, became more intense, and it wasn't long before she started talking about her vision for love. At first, I thought it was just one of those conversations where you talk about what you want out of a relationship. But as she kept going, it became clear that Lena didn't just have an idea of what she wanted. She had a very rigid, almost unattainable vision of love. She told me that she had a clear idea of what a perfect relationship should look like. I assumed she was referring to the usual stuff, mutual respect, communication, that sort of thing. But as she got into it, I began to realize that her idea of love wasn't just about finding a good partner. It was about finding someone who could fit perfectly into this idealized version of a relationship she had constructed in her mind. Lena spoke about love like it was a checklist, and if you didn't meet every single requirement, you weren't worthy of her time. I don't believe in settling, she said with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. If I'm going to be in a relationship, it's going to be with someone who matches me perfectly. Someone who can handle my ambition, my lifestyle, and my passion for life. Someone who sees the world the way I do. I tried to nod along, but something about the way she said it made me uneasy. She wasn't just talking about compatibility. She was talking about finding someone who mirrored her exactly. She wasn't interested in someone who was just a good partner. She was looking for a partner who could match her vision for life, down to every last detail. She continued, I believe in soulmate-level connections, but not just any kind of connection. It's got to be perfect. We have to be aligned in every way, our values, our future plans, and how we see the world. I wanted to understand, but the more she talked, the more I realized that Lena wasn't looking for someone to grow with. She wasn't looking for someone who could evolve and adapt with her. She was looking for someone who could already meet her standards, someone who had already done everything the right way in her mind. She talked about how her last relationship had ended because her ex didn't meet her expectations and how he wasn't ambitious enough. She said that she couldn't be with someone who wasn't ready to be everything they could be. He wasn't pushing me to be the best version of myself, she added, and that's not something I can tolerate. It started to dawn on me that Lena wasn't just speaking about her past relationship. She was talking about love like it was a performance, a checklist of qualities that needed to be ticked off in order for it to work. She wasn't interested in a love that had room for imperfections. She wasn't interested in a love where growth came through compromise and mutual understanding. Lena's vision of love was rigid, one-dimensional, and unforgiving. As the conversation continued, she went on to tell me about all the things that were non-negotiable in her relationships. I need someone who is as driven as I am, someone who can keep up with my lifestyle, she said. I work long hours, I travel a lot, and I need someone who's okay with that. If you don't have your own life, your own goals, then I'm not interested. At first, I thought, okay, fair enough. We all have our priorities. But then the more she spoke, the more I realized that it wasn't just about having a partner who could keep up with her schedule. It was about having someone who mirrored her ambition, her lifestyle, and her need for control. There was no room for compromise in her world. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be aligned. And if you didn't fit into that, you were simply out. I can't deal with someone who's not already in the right place in their life, she said, looking me straight in the eye. I need someone who's already where I am mentally and emotionally. Someone who's already figured it out. Otherwise, what are we even doing? I could feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just that I didn't meet her exact standards. It was that she wasn't even willing to entertain the idea that relationships can grow and evolve. She didn't want a partner to walk beside her, to learn together and grow together. She wanted someone who was already at the same place in life, someone who could instantly provide everything she thought a relationship should be. And then, as if to seal the deal, Lena dropped the final bombshell. I believe that you should be able to see a future with someone from the very first date. If I don't see it right away, I'm out. I'm not wasting time on something that's not going to work. It was like a punch in the gut. I wasn't looking for perfection. I wasn't looking for someone to fit into a preconceived mold. I was looking for someone I could connect with, someone who was willing to build a future together, even if that meant taking things slowly. But Lena didn't see it that way. She wasn't interested in building a relationship. She was interested in finding someone who already fit the version of love that she had in her head. As the conversation wrapped up, I realized that I wasn't going to be that person. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't about to try to fit into some idealized version of a relationship. Relationships, in my opinion, are about growing together, compromising when necessary, and being there for each other even when things aren't perfect. But Lena wasn't interested in any of that. She was only interested in perfection. I knew then that I wasn't the right person for her, and as I politely excused myself from the date, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. I wasn't angry at her. She had every right to want what she wanted. But I also realized that I wasn't looking for a relationship that felt like a job interview, where I had to prove I was good enough for someone's standards. As I walked out of the restaurant, I thought about what had just happened. It wasn't that Lena wasn't a great person, she was. But she wasn't ready to let go of this idealized version of love, and I wasn't willing to try to meet her impossible standards. Relationships should be about two people coming together, learning from each other, and accepting each other's flaws. I wasn't looking for someone who had it all figured out. I was looking for someone who was willing to grow with me, not someone who was only looking for perfection from the very start.